From his first days of power, Hitler knew that he had to bring the children of Germany under his control. The future of the Third Reich rested on their shoulders. Hitler wanted to produce a generation of dedicated and ruthless Nazis. A generation who could realize his dream of conquering the world.
Wir wollen nicht der Letzte sein in diesem Konzert der Welt, sondern wir wollen mit die Ersten sein. Das ist unser Gelöbnis. Und dass dieser Wunsch in Erfüllung geht, seid ihr mir verantwortlich, denn in euch liegt die Zukunft der Nation und des Deutschen Reichs.
The new Germany was to be forged in an organization where boys and girls would learn to dedicate their lives to Hitler. This movement was the Hitler Youth. The Hitler Youth would expand until it controlled every aspect of German children's lives.
We suddenly felt different from before. We were important and had a mission.
We were like soldiers. We were actually sworn in. Even though we were only 14, we swore to give our lives for the Führer, the people, and the fatherland.
German schools quickly fell under Nazi control. In Hitler's classrooms, children learned the art of war. Even in the kindergarten, they were taught racial theory. Graphic picture books branded the Jews a dirty and poisonous race. SS doctors measured and graded children to weed out the undesirables.
Georg Weber, Augenfarbe 2a.
There's a saying, every little drop wears away a stone. And we were like stones that water dripped onto slowly until we believed it was true and everything was okay.
In the Third Reich, everyone had their function. For girls, it was to bear children. Special classes would mold perfect Nazi mothers. Boys were sent to Hitler Youth boot camps, where they were taught to fight and prepared for war. They would be a new breed of German man. The Hitler Youth movement charmed Germany's children and seduced them to its cause. By the time Hitler took the nation to war, millions had joined its ranks. They learned total devotion to Hitler and would ultimately be asked to sacrifice everything for their master. This is the story of Hitler's children. In 1938, Germany stood at the brink of war with Europe. The highly disciplined Hitler Youth were ready to die for their fatherland. They had come a long way from their roots. The Hitler Youth movement was founded 16 years earlier in 1922, when Hitler was still the leader of an extremist fringe party. The first members were a group of boys who were too young to join the party proper. Throughout the 1920s, the Hitler Youth were branded as street brawlers and vandals. It was only as the Nazis struggled for electoral success at the end of the decade that they began to develop into a serious force. The transformation was the work of a young and ambitious Nazi student, Baldur von Schirach.
Wir sind die deutsche Zukunft. Wir sind das Deutschland von morgen.
Von Schirach set about completely restructuring the Hitler Youth. He concentrated on attracting the middle class, as Hitler had done with the party as a whole. Within a year, von Schirach had assembled 70,000 cheering boys at a rally in Potsdam.
That rally was a dream come true for us youngsters. Whereas we normally met in small groups, we assembled there for the first time en masse, and our numbers demonstrated what a political force we had become.
Ein Stück politische Bekenntnismacht.
Und meine lieben Jungs, ich glaube an die unbändige Kraft des Nationalsozialismus, die alles vernichtet, was sich ihr entgegenstemmt.
When Hitler came to power on the 30th of January 1933, he promised an end to the unemployment and poverty that had plagued the country. In its place, he would create a proud new Germany. It was a vision that struck a chord with the nation's youth.
I saw all the progress in Germany. People getting work, the flags, processions, torchlit parades. We were excited by it. It was like a mass hypnosis. It put me under its spell.
The highlight of the Nazi calendar was Hitler's birthday. The 20th of April was declared a national holiday. Every year, the Hitler Youth initiated a new crop of 10-year-olds as a gift to the Führer.
Ich war 10 Jahre alt.
When I was a 10-year-old, the papers announced that the German people were giving all 10-year-olds to the Führer. We were actually being given as a present to the Führer.
Boys were sworn into the Hitler Youth in a solemn membership ritual.
The entire troop was assembled on the sports ground. All the platoons lined up in file and publicly swore an oath of allegiance. I remember the words. I promise always to do my duty in the Hitler Youth.
Immer meine Pflicht zu tun.
Meine Pflicht zu tun. In Liebe und Treue zum Führer und unserer Fahne.
The regime was determined to attract the young. Boys couldn't wait to join the Jungvolk, the Hitler Youth Wing for 10 to 14-year-olds.
We boys felt somehow elated. Suddenly, we mattered.
In the initiation ceremonies, thousands of children dedicated their lives to Hitler.
From the local party heads to the junior boys leaders, we were now part of one big community.
The main part of the Hitler Youth was for boys, but there was a separate wing for girls.
We were a new generation, a generation that would one day rule Greater Germany. It made sense to us.
I was looking for comradeship, friendship, and something constructive to do. Most of all, though, I sought recognition, and I found it there.
We felt more at ease in the group with the uniform and the sing-alongs than we did at home with our parents.
They said of anyone who wasn't a member, he's not one of us, he's an outcast. He doesn't fit into the community of the Greater German Reich.
As the Nazis tightened their grip on Germany, the Hitler Youth movement's drive for members gathered pace. They would use any means possible to seduce Germany's youth. German boys were seduced by the Hitler Youth. One tactic was sport. From 1933, the Nazis decreed that young people could only join a sports club if they were already Hitler Youth members. And the movement organized trips to the mountains and the seaside.
Children couldn't go away on holiday. They played on the balcony or in the street. If they were especially lucky, they had a grandma with a small holding in Mecklenburg, but that was it. All of a sudden, they could go away for 2 or 3 weeks holiday. It was new to them. They hadn't traveled before.
Hitler Youth leaders realized the importance of keeping their young recruits busy. There was a set program of events every weekend.
At the age when I joined the Jungvolk, it was fun. It was fun to be with children of the same age and not just scuffle in the street or climb trees, but go on proper trips.
Bäume zu klettern, sondern Fahrten zu machen.
The highlight of the year was the Hitler Youth Summer Camp.
Da sind wir rausgefahren an so einen kleinen See und haben dort Lager gemacht. Und das war
We rode to a small lake and set up camp. It was wonderful. It was paradise for us. Lighting a campfire, cooking over it, camp life. I think all boys want to do that kind of thing. It was a regimented, warped way of playing cowboys and Indians.
Deformierte Art des Indianer sein wollen.
What mattered to us was the company of other boys, the group experience, the excursions, the physical exertion. We sweated, we froze, we got drenched in our tents. We could swear, we could let off plenty of steam, but in the end, we were a community of boys, and that's what really counted.
Das war sehr wichtig.
The trips taught the boys self-sufficiency through camping and hunting. For most, it was an entirely new experience.
Everyone sat around the fire, and we sang as the night drew in. It was dark, the stars were out. It was awe-inspiring and quite unforgettable.
Das alte nordische Feuerrad ist unser Siegeszeichen geworden.
All those things, the outings, the fire and so on, were copied. The appeal of the Jungvolk was based directly on the atmosphere of the old Youth League.
But there was a more sinister motive to the Hitler Youth activities. This was the start of a military training program. Boys were required to take part in regular tests of strength and endurance. They fought each other in war games.
Das war ja ernst, ne?
We took it seriously. Sometimes we were really hurt. We played rough.
You've no idea how determined we were before we started a field exercise.
Aggression was encouraged.
Even if we got bruised and hit and took a lot of punches, we accepted it. It toughened us up, and that's what we wanted.
At the age of 10, these boys were learning to become ruthless soldiers.
In the
Hitler Youth, they taught us to be tough. It was all part of a plan. What did Hitler say a German boy must be?
Flink wie Windhunde, zäh wie Leder und hart wie Kruppstahl.
Older boys could quickly move up the ranks in the Hitler Youth and become platoon leaders. They were told to show younger recruits no mercy.
I went to my platoon leader and said, "I report that my father has died." As I told him this, I started to cry. The tears flowed. I couldn't talk anymore. My voice failed me. And then this platoon leader addressed me very curtly. It was more like shouting, really. He said, "A German boy doesn't cry." Since that moment, I've never shed another tear.
Was wir uns unter der deutschen Jugend der Zukunft wünschen, ist etwas anderes, als was die Vergangenheit sich gewünscht hat. Wir müssen einen neuen Menschen erziehen.
Bin ich erst mal groß und nicht mehr klein.
When I'm big and out of infancy, a soldier of the Führer I'll be. That was the kind of slogan that captured my attention. I felt like repeating it when my mother said, "That's so childish." I remember thinking, "Mother dear, I haven't been a child for ages. I'll soon be a soldier."
Ich bin bald ein Soldat.
Hitler Youth leaders cleverly tapped into teenagers' naturally rebellious streak. They encouraged boys to distance themselves from their parents.
We used to spend Sundays with our parents. We'd go out on a boat or for a walk or play a game. But all that stopped because we were told, "You can't go everywhere with your parents. You're a mummy's boy." None of us wanted to be a mummy's boy, me included, so we tried to cut the apron strings.
Also musste man sich von den Eltern abnabeln.
Ja, und da kam dann also der Konflikt mit dem Elternhaus.
It caused trouble at home. On Sunday mornings, while my father was preaching, I preferred to attend Hitler Youth meetings. I did drill on the square with the other boys, or march through the village singing songs.
Mit den Jungen exerziert oder bin Lieder singend mit denen durchs Dorf marschiert.
Ahnen Sie eigentlich, was hier vor sich geht? Spüren Sie denn nicht, dass hier etwas besudelt wird, was Ihnen eigentlich heilig sein müsste? Hat unser Volk nicht lang genug unter völkischem Minderwertigkeitsgefühl gelitten?
Propaganda films like this encouraged the cult of youth.
Was erlauben Sie sich die Grüngabe? Wir sind hier eine geschlossene Gesellschaft. Mit welchem Recht kommen Sie hier herein und protestieren?
Ich protestiere mit dem Recht der Jugend.
Die Aufmüpfigkeit, die ist Teil...
Rebelliousness was exploited by the Hitler Youth and used for the purposes of the Third Reich.
Und für die Zwecke des Dritten Reiches.
We rebelled against the rest of the world.
Wir waren aufmüpfig gegen die ganze übrige Welt. Das ganze Dritte Reich war eine
The whole of the Third Reich was a rebellion against the civilized, humane world.
As Hitler increased his stranglehold over Germany through the 1930s, the Hitler Youth became more and more important in boys' lives. The number of meetings and activities expanded to fill their free time and allow them no respite from Nazi thinking.
Das in Sklavenketten liegt, die wir Jungen einst zerbrechen werden. Wir erneuern in dieser Nacht dem Führer und seiner Idee die Treueschwur. Sieg! Heil!
For many boys, loyalty to the Führer replaced loyalty to their families.
Ich habe ja mich dann als Hitlerjunge geschämt. Zu meinem Bedauern muss ich das heute sagen. Aber
I'm sorry to have to admit that when I was a member of the Hitler Youth, I was actually ashamed of my father because he wanted nothing to do with National Socialism.
Nationalsozialismus nichts wissen wollte. Und ich habe mit meinem Bruder in einer Kammer neben der Küche geschlafen.
My brother and I slept in a little room next to the kitchen. One night I heard voices. I heard that it was a Jew and he wanted to cross the border.
Und da hat mein Vater gesagt, er soll da bleiben, bis halt oben, bringt ihn über.
My father said he'd take him over that night. And so he crossed the border with the Jew and came back alone. I wished, I'll be perfectly honest with you, I wished at that very moment that I wasn't the son of such parents.
But in many homes, parents were happy to see their children become diligent Nazi pupils.
Es hat Elternhäuser gegeben, wo...
There were homes where the boys were told, keep your hearts free. It wasn't like that with me. All my classmates' parents supported the Nazis.
Alle Eltern für die Nazis. Niemand hat mich...
No one encouraged me or gave me the nerve to oppose the Nazis. And everything was 100% in those days. I succumbed to the Nazis 100%.
Hundertprozentig. Also ich bin 100%ig dann den Nazis verfallen.
The regime ensured that children repeatedly heard a simple yet seductive message. They were Germany's future.
The concept of youth was idealized.
Ihr seid einmal Deutschlands Zukunft, denn ihr seid einmal Deutschland. Ihr seid einmal unser Volk. Ihr seid einmal nicht die Hoffnung, sondern ihr müsst dann die Vollendung dessen sein, was wir erhoffen.
Ihr seid.
You are. The young are. Old people have no idea. They're past it. They've had their day. Young people love to hear that kind of thing.
Menschen an.
By 1935, the Nazis had charmed 4 million young Germans into joining the Hitler Youth, half the nation's children. It was now time to forcibly recruit the rest. In 1935, a mass rally was organized at Nuremberg by the leader of the Hitler Youth, Baldur von Schirach.
Mein Führer, ich melde Ihnen die größte Jugendkundgebung der Welt. Ich melde Ihnen den freiwillig vollzogenen Eintritt von 917.445 Jugendlichen am 20. April dieses Jahres. Heil Jugend!
Als wir dann diese Mengen sahen, dass wir nicht allein...
When we saw the crowds, and there were thousands and thousands of us, all in the same uniform, we felt elated because they were all like us. I saw boys cry.
Ich habe
To me, that was unusual. In uniform, in the middle of the day, they were crying.
in Uniform am
I went over to one of them because it bothered me that a German boy in our group should be crying.
Das störte mich, dass das vielleicht in unserer Gruppe da...
I asked what was wrong, and he said, "It was so lovely. It was so lovely that I'm trembling."
So schön. Das ist so schön Ich zittere.
The rally was an important propaganda tool in the Nazis' policy of Gleichschaltung, the idea that class should be eradicated from German society. For the Nazis, the Hitler Youth was a shining example of Gleichschaltung at work.
Durch die Uniform waren wir
The uniform made us all virtually equal, although we came from different social classes. A uniform put the son of a tradesman or a worker on the same level as the son of a professor. We were comrades.
Wir waren Kameraden.
Meine Kameraden, nach Ihrem Befehl, mein Führer, steht hier eine Jugend, die keine Klasse und keine Kaste kennt.
This imposition of uniformity meant the dispossession of the German boy and the destruction of his individuality. This was von Schirach's aim, and he achieved it.
Alle Jugend dem Führer, das ist die Parole der HJ. Und wie in den vergangenen Jahren rufen wir auch heute den Jahrgang der 10-Jährigen zum Dienst unter Adolf Hitlers Fahne.
In 1936, as Germany prepared to host the Berlin Olympics, the Hitler Youth movement launched its most ambitious recruitment drive yet. Boys turning 10 that year were identified from birth certificates, and their parents were then visited by Hitler Youth members. A mixture of charm and threats persuaded 90% of parents to enroll their children. Those who refused to join faced sanctions.
It wasn't what I'd call voluntary. There was no real possibility, at least in normal circumstances, of not joining the Hitler Youth or the Jungvolk. That is, if you didn't want to be a real outsider, even at school.
Vom HJ-Gericht hatte die Schule ein Schreiben gekriegt, dass ich von der
The school got a letter from the Hitler Youth Tribunal saying I should be expelled. I didn't deserve to go to a grammar school because I hadn't joined the Hitler Youth.
Und der Direktor hat dann
The headmaster then suggested to my parents that they might like to take me out of school straight away.
melden möchten, noch am selben Tage vom Gymnasium.
Non-Nazi youth groups continued to meet, but if discovered, they risked trouble from the Hitler Youth security patrols.
We were just having a normal meeting when a Hitler Youth patrol of 20 or 25 boys, all strapping lads, burst in and started to thrash us.
Der Höhepunkt war vielleicht der, dass wir einmal, als wir von
Our worst experience came one Sunday evening when we were returning from an excursion. The Hitler Youth were waiting on the bridge over the Oder. They beat us up and pushed the leader of our small group, 19-year-old Konrad Feicht, off the bridge.
von der Brücke geschmissen.
The Hitler Youth had annexed every other youth movement in Germany.
We thought that now we could determine how society was organized. The other youth organizations were disbanded and incorporated into the Hitler Youth.
Any boys who still refused to sign up felt the consequences.
Nun gingen die stramm dort vorbei, mit der Fahne voran.
They marched briskly past, the flag at the front. Suddenly one of them stepped out of the middle of the column, boxed my ears and said, "Salute the flag." Naturally, I was shocked.
Stand da und war natürlich schockiert. Du darfst nicht abseits stehen.
I thought I'd better not be left out. If I joined, I wouldn't be punched. I'd be one of them, and then I might do the punching.
Welche austeilen.
Plötzlich hörte mein Vater Schläge, Trommelschläge.
Suddenly, my father heard the sound of drum beats. I heard them too. They were getting closer. They echoed dreadfully in the narrow street. Then I remembered that my classmates had said, "If you don't join the Jungvolk, we'll come and get you." Is that what was happening?
Sollte das wahr werden?
They came closer, formed a semicircle outside our door. Then the doorbell rang. We were afraid. I went out, and 2 boys came either side of me and led me to the last of the groups, and I had to fall in line. I saw another boy in civvies, and I realized they were rounding up more boys. We started marching, and the marching itself fused us into a single entity. If you control the streets, you control the people.
Der Straße war, der hatte die Menschen.
Every conceivable youth activity was now under Nazi control.
Die alleine, dass jeder Hitlerjunge...
The idea that every Hitler Youth and Jungvolk member could do whatever he was interested in was the great attraction. But you could only do that if you were good enough.
Man durfte zuerst auch nur, wenn man gute Leistungen gebracht hatte.
Boys were forced to compete at everything. They were bullied and humiliated if they didn't fit in.
If you couldn't jump more than 5 meters, you were a loser. You were rejected and ridiculed. Ausgestoßen und lächerlich gemacht.
Leistung musste man auf irgendeine Weise bringen, jeder auf seine Art.
You had to be good at something. Everybody could be good at something. Develop a positive self-image and feel important.
Gefühl entwickeln und sich bedeutend fühlen.
The Hitler Youth taught boys vocational skills so that one day they could fuel the German war effort. But even in the factories and workshops, a competitive element was introduced.
Wir haben im Reichsberufswettkampf die gesamte junge Generation Deutschlands auf dieses Leistungsprinzip verpflichtet.
You got a certificate to say that you had passed with a certain mark. Naturally, it was an honor.
The toughest and most loyal Hitler Youth members quickly advanced.
We were assessed by our platoon leaders on the basis of points awarded for sport, field exercises and so on, and also for how we behaved, how well we sang and how clearly we spoke when we explained something. All these attributes were noted, and that was how one rose through the ranks.
Jeder lauerte drauf, eine neue Schnur.
Everyone was dying to get a new lanyard or pennant to signify a promotion. The attraction was that every German could rise into a position of command over someone who in their turn commanded someone else. Nearly everybody had a position of some kind, even young people.
Und so war es auch bei den Jugendlichen.
The hierarchy of the Hitler Youth was an important part of its appeal. Boys were seduced by the idea of controlling their peers.
When you stood there and said, halt, eyes left, eyes right, look to the front, and you didn't have to take part, you were the one giving the orders, that made you feel pretty good about yourself.
Das war immer wieder ein Erlebnis, so vor der Front zu stehen.
It was quite an experience to stand there, give orders, and have the feeling you were important without knowing why.
Ohne zu wissen was.
You were elated because you had a position of authority.
Durch diese Autorität gehoben.
Ein 12-Jähriger kann dann schon 10-Jährige.
A 12-year-old could command 10 10-year-olds. Halt, lie down, for they have to throw themselves down. You set your goals higher and higher. As a squad leader, you had 30 boys under you. As a platoon leader, you had 100. You could order them about. That's seductive for boys. The Nazis knew that, and they exploited it. A lot of boys fell for it. I, for one.
Bei vielen damals, wie zum Beispiel bei mir, hat's geklappt.
The boys were ruled with a rod of iron.
When the order to sing was given, we had to sing. If it wasn't loud enough, we'd be scolded. We were totally straitjacketed. There was no freedom at all.
If I gave an order, I would expect it to be carried out. If I said sing, then of course they'd sing. If I gave them marching orders, they marched. It was taken for granted. They did it as unquestioningly in the Hitler Youth as they did it later in the army.
Nichts ist möglich, wenn nicht ein Wille befiehlt, denn immer die anderen zu gehorchen haben. Von oben beginnend und ganz unten erst endend.
Orders were followed blindly. You didn't question them. Orders were orders. It was simple. If you didn't obey, you would be treated accordingly.
Hitler, Junge Hitler, bietet von der weiteren Teilnahme an einem Lehrgang entbunden zu werden. Na nu? Was ist denn mit dir los? Ja, Führer, ich glaube, ich schaffe das nicht, was dir alles verlangt wird. Ich denke, du willst Offizier werden. Und da willst du schon nach 3 Tagen schlapp machen. Ich will dir mal was sagen. Ob du das hier schaffst oder nicht, das bestimmen wir und nicht du. Reiß dich mal gefälligst zusammen. Jawohl, Führer. Wegreden, wegreden.
The individual didn't count. They never asked, can you do that? How do you feel? Do you like that? We had to get on with it, and we did. We had taken the oath.
The Hitler Youth boys were being trained to follow orders for a reason. They had to be prepared to carry out the extremes of Nazism without question. The Hitler Youth operated in clubhouses as well as training camps. Here, youth leaders taught boys about military tactics and lectured in Nazi philosophy.
We learnt about the lives of the Nazi leaders and the anti-Jewish campaign. It was like a school lesson in National Socialism.
Hitler Youth leaders were given carefully selected phrases to read out.
The goal of the Jews is to brutally rule other races. In this, the Jewish people reveals itself in all its madness and its brutal thirst for power.
They were elegant, very elegant indeed, in the way they told us things in small doses. One small dose at a time, and then a tiny bit more. That way we didn't notice what they were doing to us.
When we were marching, we used to bawl out an unbelievably vile song. Hang the Jews, line the fat cats up against the wall. Probably not one of us stopped to think about what those words actually meant.
What the boys learned in meetings was put into practice on the streets.
Then we started marching. We came to the local bank. There was a glass case in which Der Stürmer, the extreme Nazi tabloid, was displayed. Our platoon leader saw the case and roared, "Death to Jude." The cry was taken up by the boys in the front and travelled down the line to me at the back. It was a crisis of conscience. I couldn't join in, I couldn't. I just mouthed the words. But then something clicked. The idea came to me that Jude was a country somewhere far away, and if I said, "Death to a country," I wasn't hurting people. I joined in the shouting. It was terrible.
On the 9th of November 1938, the Nazis launched a major attack on the Jews. It became known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass.
Enthusiastically, I went to see where the fire was burning. It was next to our school. I wondered why they only put out the house fires next door and not the main fire, until a Hitler Youth friend said, "Hey, we lit that. Weren't you there this morning when we smashed the Jew shop windows and took stuff?" Then I saw stormtroopers and Hitler Youth members carrying out Torah scrolls. They cheered as they threw them onto the fire. 2 days after Kristallnacht, all Ludwigsburg was whispering, "Our doctor, Dr. Pintus, is dead." He was arrested on Kristallnacht in the evening and took cyanide in the prison van because he knew what was coming. I was 13 years old. It struck me for the first time that 3 years earlier I'd shouted death to Judah, and now he was really dead.
Most boys were hardened to the horrors of Kristallnacht. They had learned to trust Hitler completely.
Glaube, der unabdingbare Glaube.
Faith, unconditional faith, that the Führer would do things right.
Ist uns ja damals als der
He was represented in those days as God, well, akin to God.
Gottähnliche.
And that's how we saw him.
Das haben wir auch darin gesehen.
War ein Idol, es war ein halber Gott für uns.
He was our idol. He was a demigod. I tell you quite honestly, if someone had tried to shoot Hitler, I'd have leapt forwards and died for him. Nowadays, I know it was madness.
Und als Wahnsinn, ne?
In 1932, Herbert Norkus, a 15-year-old member of the Hitler Youth, was murdered. He had died after a violent street fight with members of the Communist Party. Hitler Youth leaders immortalized Norkus as the hero of a film. They made sure every member of the movement saw Herbert Norkus martyr himself to the Nazi cause.
Perfekt. Flattert uns.
Wir haben den bewundert, den Jungen.
We admired him. A shiver used to run down our spines.
Gänsehaut über den Rücken gelaufen. Du bist eigentlich nichts, dein Leben ist nichts wert, du musst es...
You're nothing? Your life is worthless. You must be ready to sacrifice your life to the flag. It was an appeal to the young that sentenced them to death. Can there be a greater crime than that? It was an appeal made to 12- and 13-year-old boys.
12-, 13-jährige Jungs gerufen.
Früh übt sich, was ein Meister werden will.
Hitler Youth boys were invited to visit army barracks, use the firing ranges, and take part in training maneuvers.
Geländespiele haben wir selbstverständlich gemacht, in denen man...
Of course, we did field exercises in which we tried to behave like soldiers. Move forwards properly. Don't let yourselves be seen. Creep up on them and so on. Children love that kind of thing. And they exploited that. But these games were immensely entertaining, and you can seduce people that way.
Man kann ja auch auf das Spielerischste verführen.
By 1936, Germany's army, the Wehrmacht, was playing an increasingly prominent role in the Hitler Youth.
Das war das Ziel des Führers.
The Führer's goal was to train young people as soldiers. Young men the world would fear. That's what he once said. And the world did fear them.
Dieser Jugend ist die Welt ja dann auch erschrocken.
When war finally came, boys who had been trained in specialist camps from the age of 10 finally had a chance to fight. For the Hitler Youth, war was the culmination of everything they had learned.
It unleashed a certain enthusiasm in us. Poland was a surprise to me as a 13-year-old, but I still remember the entry into Paris, the occupation of Paris, and the quick end to the French campaign. That certainly filled us with enthusiasm.
The country was euphoric after Hitler's success against the French in 1940. Teenage boys from the Hitler Youth rushed to volunteer to serve their nation.
We were eager to become real soldiers and go to war properly, although naturally we had no idea how cruel this war would become.
The Hitler Youth had seduced a generation of German boys into believing in the Nazi cause. But in serving Hitler, many of them would be called upon to make the ultimate sacrifice. The Hitler Youth movement taught German children how to be good Nazis. Its principal aim was to turn boys into tough and obedient fighters, boys who could then wage Hitler's war across Europe. But girls also had a place in the Hitler Youth, designed exclusively for them. It was called the Bund Deutscher Mädel, or BDM, the League of German Girls.
At an age when you don't yet have much of a personality, it's wonderful to be part of such a huge movement of people, all thinking, feeling and doing the same thing.
The biggest draw was Hitler himself. For millions of teenage girls, he wasn't just a politician, he was a pin-up.
Hitler looked into my eyes and patted my cheek. It was an incredible experience for me. I thought it was great, and I didn't want to wash. My mother said, "You're crazy." And so I was.
Girls would be used to breed a new generation of Nazis. The BDM ensured that they were well versed in their duties.
We need mothers who understand their role in life. They should follow the beat of their light hearts, be proud to call themselves German, and carry out their duties with joy and conviction.
The Hitler Youth movement taught Germany's girls to become Hitler's most loyal servants. By the end of the war, they would be asked to sacrifice everything for their idol. The Bund Deutscher Mädel, or BDM, was founded in 1930. Within a few years, it was the largest girls' organization in the world.
We played, laughed, sang, and even plaited wreaths into each other's hair. We celebrated the Harvest Festival because we had plenty of bread to eat.
The BDM offered girls a sense of community and purpose.
It didn't matter whether you lived in a big house or a tenement flat, whether you were Protestant or Catholic. We were all young Germans together.
Girls could join the BDM at 14, or its junior section, the Jungmädel, at 10.
Wenn Sie ein Schulkind sind, ist es für ein 10-jähriges oder 12...
If you're a school child aged 10 or 12, it's a wonderful feeling to go to the headmaster and say, "Heil Hitler, Mr. Meyer, Müller or Schmidt. I can't come to school for this lesson. I'm on duty."
In die Schule kommen, ich habe Dienst.
Girls were encouraged to join the movement as a way to serve their country.
I was a young girl of 15 or 16, and tears came to my eyes because I felt that I belonged to the wonderful German nation.
Dieses wunderbaren deutschen Volkes empfand.
The BDM excluded Jewish girls on racial grounds.
Of course, I'd have loved to have been a member. I envied all the girls who wore the blue skirt and white blouse, so it was hard for me. Later, I realized I was Jewish and it wasn't for me.
BDM meetings were used to teach girls about Nazi ideology. There were regular lessons on Lebensraum, the idea of Germany expanding eastwards so the Aryan race had room to flourish.
The whole of the political background certainly wasn't clear to me at the time. I was simply working to pass on what I could.
Und die Morgenfrühe, das ist unsere Zeit, wenn die Winde um die Berge singen, tut euch nicht lang verweilen.
Girls were indoctrinated through songs.
Erde schafft das Neue, Erde nimmt das Alte, deutsche heile Erde, unsere
Forwards, forwards, the fanfares blare. Forwards, forwards, youth knows no danger. Germany must shine, even if we die.
Youth, we are the future soldiers. Youth, we'll do the future deeds. Though we trembled, no one dared to argue. We were part of a new age. Who wouldn't go along with it? It was fantastic. Unfortunately, I can't sing anymore. I sometimes feel like belting it out again.
We adopted those words unthinkingly. We just rattled off what we were taught because we thought it must be right.
Weil man glaubte, das muss ja richtig sein.
In Nazi Germany, girls were expected to know their place.
Ich denke, das ist wunderbar. Na, hast du das bekommen? Was hast du Schönes bekommen? Flieger? Na, wirst du auch ein Flieger werden? Was? Wenn du groß bist, was wirst du denn? Was wirst du? Ach, du bist ja Mädel.
I thought it was a terrible fate to have been born a girl. I couldn't give my life to the fatherland.
Leben dem Vaterland nicht zur Verfügung stellen.
Hitler never imagined the BDM girls would join the army, but their training echoed that of the Hitler Youth boys. At camps, they were drilled like soldiers and faced tests of endurance and courage.
Die wurden ganz schön drangsaliert.
It was really torture. If you said you couldn't swim, you were thrown into the water. Really brutal when I think about it now.
Brutal, also schon brutal, wenn ich heute dran denke, ja.
Marching was an important part of BDM life. The idea was to break down individuality and build a collective spirit.
Of course, if you want to get troops to move from one place to another, they have to march in step. Otherwise, it won't work. Sheep need a sheepdog. Marching in step has the same effect. It's all about discipline.
Zur Disziplin.
The BDM girls held their own flag days and memorial parades on Nazi holidays. These were deliberately scheduled to compete with the church calendar and marginalize religion in Nazi Germany. New recruits were sworn in at powerful torchlit ceremonies.
Ich schwöre bei Gott diesen heiligen Eid. Ich werde meinem Führer Adolf Hitler allezeit treu und gehorsam sein.
Das war
We were like soldiers. We were actually sworn in. Even though we were only 14, we swore to give our lives for the Führer, the people, and the fatherland.
The BDM's most seductive tool in recruiting new members was Hitler himself. The girls idolized him. A lucky few were invited to his exclusive mountain retreat to appear in newsreels. But for Hitler, the BDM was about more than propaganda. BDM girls idolized Hitler. When he appeared in public, hordes of girls flooded to the streets to get a glimpse of him. It was not uncommon for them to pass out with emotion. For many Germans, Hitler had become a superhuman figure.
War der Übervater.
We called him our Übervater. It's inconceivable today.
Heute nicht nachzuvollziehen.
Es war schon.
It was a deep, heartfelt love. I can't express it any other way.
Ausdrücken.
Exactly like God. For me, he was just like God.
Hitler was single, which added to the attraction.
Schade, dass der keine Frau hat.
We said, pity he's not married, a nice man like that. It might make things better for him.
Love letters arrived for Hitler every day.
Dear Führer, will you please accept my sacrifice? I have nothing to give you except my love. Yours, Emmy.
Dear Führer, a girl from Saxony would like to have your baby. I know it's a very unusual suggestion, but it really bothers me that a man like you is childless.
Their requests went unheeded, Hitler pretended he'd given up women for work. His girlfriend, Eva Braun, had to be discreet. Even at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat near Salzburg, she masqueraded as a member of staff.
We went for a walk together, and then I said to her, almost provocatively, "Miss Braun, you're the most envied woman in Germany," because she was with Adolf Hitler. She said, "Oh, Mr. Frenz, I'm just a prisoner in a gilded cage."
Eva Braun would die at Hitler's side, still loyal to the man who never acknowledged her in public. Hitler believed women should be subservient to men. In Nazi Germany, their main task was to bear children. Many girls faithfully accepted these teachings.
What the Führer does is right. That's how it was. The Führer can't be wrong.
Die Frau hat auch ihr Schlachtfeld. Mit jedem Kind, das sie der Nation zur Welt bringt, kämpft sie diesen Kampf durch. Das ist ihr Kampf für die Nation und der Mann hat seinen Kampf. Der Mann tritt für das Volk ein, genauso wie die Frau für die Familie eintritt. Der Mann tritt für die Gesamtheit der Volksgenossen ein, genauso wie die Frau eintritt für die Kinder, denen sie selbst das Leben schenkt.
After the war, they told us we'd been living without freedom. This was new to me. I didn't realize that I wasn't free because I didn't understand the concept of freedom as we know it today.
The BDM told girls that once married, they should have as many children as possible to serve the Nazi cause. The movement also arranged classes where girls could learn how to bring up their children as good Nazis. There was even a reward for providing the Führer with his future armies. Women who had 4 or more children were awarded the Mother's Cross. When it came to sex, the official line was strict. Girls had to keep themselves pure for marriage.
One rule was drummed into us. Keep your blood pure. It's not just yours. It comes from afar and flows a long way, and everyone's future flows in it. Keep the vessel of your immortality pure. It was clear.
Girls who became pregnant outside of marriage were thrown out of the BDM.
Young people were very different then. Now, the average age when they become sexually active is 15. It was over 20 for us.
I remember how proud we were if a male youth leader fell for us. But we shrugged our shoulders and said, "I'm a German girl." A German girl is chaste and modest and becomes a mother as soon as she marries.
Despite the rules, Nazi officials were not put off trying their luck with the BDM girls.
With the older party members, it was as though they'd been allowed out by their mothers for the first time. And there were young girls around, so all sorts of things went on, affairs and so on.
The BDM girls were expected to take part in huge public gymnastic displays. These were meant to teach an important lesson. Girls should not think of themselves as individuals, but as part of the German nation.
When I saw that every movement was identical, I was incredibly proud to be part of it. It was drummed into us. One wrong movement and you'll ruin the whole picture.
At the age of 18, BDM girls were encouraged to join a group called Belief and Beauty, a living embodiment of the Aryan ideal.
People still rave about it today. It was an aesthetic pleasure to see hundreds of girls all moving in harmony in those short and cheeky yet ladylike uniforms. What was so wrong with it?
The Aryan ideal was echoed in the work of Hitler's favorite film director, Leni Riefenstahl. Her films became an important propaganda tool in teaching German girls the importance of racial purity.
Race was the most important word in our life. There were things that embarrassed me, both at school and in the League of German Girls. Because of my appearance, I was taken as an example of the Aryan race. It was terrible.
We were jealous of all the girls in our class with blonde plaits and blue eyes. That's how far it went.
Once the Nazis had risen to power in 1933, doctors routinely measured and graded children to identify their racial groups. Promotional films explained to girls the importance of a suitable marriage.
Sehen Sie mal, bei sämtlichen Vorfahren die gleich guten Eigenschaften. Guter Jäger, guter Jäger, guter Jäger.
Da sieht man erst mal, wie wichtig die genaue Aufzeichnung der Vorfahren ist.
Ja, und erst recht für uns Menschen.
Ja, dann würde die Gattenwahl manchmal anders ausfallen. Nicht mehr zufällig, sondern bewusst wird das Gesunde sich zum Gesunden finden. Zur glücklichen und richtigen Gattenwahl. Gebt euer Bestes eurem Volke, dann werdet ihr zum besten Volke gehören.
We were the best people in the world, and the most competent, and the most beautiful people in the world. Jews are exactly the opposite. That's what we were told.
At BDM meetings, girls learned what the Nazis called racial science. The lessons were reinforced in the anti-Semitic magazine, Der Stürmer.
I passed 2 display cases on my way to school. Young children walked past them as well. The cases displayed a newspaper called Der Stürmer. I have no idea who thought it up. It showed Jews, and I was fascinated by it as the pictures were horrifying.
On the streets, the message was the same. Jewish shops were the targets of graffiti and vandalism.
Dieses ostjüdische Untermenschentum hat seit jeher Westeuropa das internationale Verbrechergesindel geliefert. Von hier aus wurden die Demokratien mit Taschendieben, Zuhältern, Rauschgift- und Mädchenhändlern, internationalen Bankschiebern und Hetzjournalisten versorgt.
There's a saying, every little drop wears away a stone. And we were like stones that water dripped onto slowly until we believed it was true. And everything was okay.
Many girls blindly swallowed the propaganda.
Some were sorry and others indifferent. They said, "We're National Socialists and in the BDM. You're not. You're a Jewish bitch. I have nothing against you personally, but you Jews are to blame for everything." That was the way it was.
Das war die Tendenz.
The regime also targeted other racial groups.
I was even scared when I walked past them in a colourful skirt. They knew I was a gypsy child, and they spat on the ground or right into my face. And they shouted out, "Gypsy trash," and that kind of thing.
The 9th of November 1938 was Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. BDM girls couldn't avoid the carnage that Hitler unleashed on the country's Jewish communities.
They were pulling an old lady down the stairs by the hair, and I stood there thinking, what are they doing? What is this? But then I thought she'd done something wrong and must be a criminal. But I know I vomited afterwards. It upset me so much that it made me sick. Younger children also saw things like that.
So Dinge haben auch Kinder gesehen.
Within months of Kristallnacht, Germany was at war. The BDM girls were to play a far greater role in this conflict than even Hitler could have dreamed. The Nazis invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939. More than 90,000 Polish people died. But Nazi propaganda convinced many Germans that the Poles had been the aggressors.
The enemy was outside us. That bonded us as a nation. They were the baddies. We thought, at least I did, that the Poles had attacked us and we were just defending ourselves, which was okay.
BDM girls were active in the victory celebrations. German schoolchildren wrote essays commemorating the occasion.
We are full of heartfelt gratitude to our William Tell and place our fate in his, Adolf Hitler's, hands. It will be the sacred duty of us all to protect and complete our fatherland, for the arch-enemies who surround us are trying again and again to cut us down in our prime and destroy our country in a war of annihilation. We wrote nonsense like that in those days. That's how we were trained as National Socialists.
The BDM girls were called on to take the place of the thousands of men away fighting.
Die Millionen schaffender Jungen und Mädel in der deutschen Rüstungsproduktion, bei der Betreuung unserer Soldaten, bei der Nachbarschafts- und Einkaufshilfe unserer Mädel, als Helferinnen in den Säuglingspflegestätten, bei der täglichen Zustellung der Zeitungen, bei den Austrägerdiensten der Reichspost und als Hilfsschaffner bei den Straßenbahnen, als Kindergärtnerinnen, in den Nähstuben der Mädel zur Behebung der ersten Not, als Erntehelfer des deutschen Bauern und bei der Unterstützung der deutschen Bäuerin.
On our social evenings, we made things for the soldiers. We knitted for them and wrote letters to them. We felt we had to help them as they were fighting for us.
Helping on the home front was not enough for some girls who fantasized about doing much more.
As a young girl, I sometimes stood in front of the mirror in a heroic pose, imagining myself sacrificing my life for the Führer, the people, and the fatherland. Then everyone else could keep on living in peace and the Reich could be preserved. Every now and then I had strange impulses like that.
Erhalten bleiben. Solche seltsamen Anwandlungen hatte ich hin und wieder.
The older BDM girls took over the role of tram conductors. It was here that one girl noticed the beginning of something more sinister.
Wir hatten einmal eine Sonderfahrt.
Once we had a special trip. They said, don't sell tickets to those two carriages. They are just travelling as far as the railway station. Those people were probably taken off and killed. I should have realised then that something was going on, and perhaps I even did at the time.
By 1940, deportations were becoming increasingly common across Nazi Germany. Classmates of BDM girls would often disappear without warning.
Wir wohnten noch in der Stadt.
We were still living in town. I went to pick her up to go to school. We weren't even 10 years old. There was a truck in front of the building and they were throwing furniture into it. As a child, I was terribly upset and said, "That is so mean. She didn't tell me she's moving out."
Sie sagt mir nicht Bescheid, dass sie auszieht.
In 1943, it became compulsory for women between 17 and 45 to work for the war effort. More than 3 million teenage girls were employed in the manufacturing and armaments industries. A 60-hour week was the norm. The BDM had become an essential part of the German war machine.
Unsere Mutter hat immer gesagt,
our mother always told us, do whatever you're told or asked to do, or they'll put you in a camp, even if you're Aryan. Don't make any mistakes. Any mistake could kill.
Jeder Fehler ist kann tödlich sein.
Ravensbrück was a concentration camp for women near Berlin. The guards who worked there were recruited from the ranks of the BDM. They were encouraged to show the inmates no mercy.
Wenn einer was gesagt hat, Schnauze.
If anyone spoke, they'd say, "Shut your gob. Shut your gob," and then sometimes they'd slap you. You'd end up bleeding. She'd hit us over the head, over and over again. It was incredibly humiliating to have to take that from a woman.
Wahnsinnige Demütigung von einer Frau sich zu gefallen lassen.
In 1944, as Germany struggled to fight a war on two fronts, Hitler bowed to pressure from his military chiefs. Women were allowed to join the army. This was a complete turnaround.
Ich würde mich schämen, ein deutscher Mann zu sein, wenn jemals im Falle eines Krieges auch nur eine Frau an eine Front stehen müsste. Wenn Männer so erbärmlich werden und so feige werden, dass sie ein solches Vorgehen dann entschuldigen mit dem Wort Gleichberechtigung der Frau. Nein, das ist nicht Gleichberechtigung, denn die Natur hat die Frau dafür nicht geschaffen. Sie hat sie geschaffen, dass sie die Wunden des Mannes pflegt. Das ist ihre Aufgabe.
I volunteered as a signals assistant to win the war, because I simply thought it had to happen and I had to help.
Einkleidung. Jede Nachrichtenhelferin bekommt ein Kostüm, 2 Blusen, mehrere Paar Strümpfe und Schuhe, einen Mantel und das schmucke Schiffchen.
The war was promoted as a noble adventure.
Ein monatliches Gehalt. Zahllose deutsche Frauen und Mädchen lernen als Nachrichtenhelferinnen die Schönheiten Großdeutschlands und Europas kennen. Vor allem aber sind sie unseren Soldaten Helferinnen zum Sieg.
Women saw far more of the action than promotional films revealed. As the war in the skies over Germany intensified, young women joined male comrades manning the flak guns.
It was bad. I remember one occasion when I actually had an enemy in my sights. If I'd obeyed the orders we'd been given, I'd have had to push the button. But I didn't do it. I couldn't.
Aber ich hab's nicht getan. Ich konnte es nicht.
After just a few months, more than 500,000 young women were in military uniform. But many were untrained and ill-suited to their new role.
Once, during a terrible attack, the girls operating the searchlight in the next position to us ran off to look for shelter as there were so many bombs. They were shot for cowardice in the face of the enemy.
Die hat man erschossen. Wegen Feigheit vor dem Feind.
Young BDM girls also helped the war effort as auxiliary workers.
Es ging immer darum, so möglichst viele Menschen lebendig da rauszuholen.
We had to try to get as many people as possible out alive. Today, I wonder how we did it at the age of 14 or 15. There were picks, like ice picks. We used them and our hands to remove all the rubble. And when we finally got a window open and the first person came out, the joy was indescribable.
Das kann ich Ihnen gar nicht sagen. Ich hatte fürchterliche Angst.
I was terrified, but I was a hero. I did my bit.
Girls working on the home front were expected to put out fires, clear rubble, look after bomb victims, and run the soup kitchens. For many of these girls, seeing the effects of war so close to home made them determined to fight back.
Der fand das furchtbar, aber Zweifel.
We thought it was dreadful. But we did not doubt the rightness of it all. We felt that it had been done to us. We barely considered that we were doing things to others through our soldiers, our army and our air raids. We just wanted revenge for what had been done to us.
Bedacht nur, was man uns antat. Und dafür mussten wir uns eigentlich rächen.
Und da lagen so in Reihe und Glied die Toten.
There were rows of corpses covered with blankets with name tags on their chest. It was our job to look for a hand under the blanket and attach the name tag to it. I was curious and pushed the top of the blanket aside and saw a blue head, dark blue. And then I felt sick. Then all I felt was fear, fear, fear that I'd failed. I can't tell you. Just failed, failed, failed.
Und dann hatte ich nur Angst, 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 du hast versagt. Ich kann Ihnen gar nicht sagen, nur versagt, versagt, versagt.
BDM girls were trained to show no signs of weakness. They were expected to put on a brave face when visiting military hospitals.
Auch die Mädel vom BDM machen unseren Verwundeten gelegentlich eine Freude.
The reality of life in Nazi hospitals was very different from the newsreel propaganda. Many girls found it hard to cope with what they saw.
Ich habe in einem Reservelazarett.
I worked in a reserve hospital. The soldiers from the Eastern Front were there. I was deeply affected to see young men without legs, with gunshot wounds lying there between life and death.
Schussverletzungen. Da lagen.
Some were in such pain that they couldn't sleep. Not even the strong drugs like morphine could help them. It was shattering.
Morphium und was wir hatten, hat mitunter geholfen. Also das war erschütternd.
Young women were trained by the Volkssturm, the Home Guard, to prepare them for an Allied invasion.
Da wurde ich zum Volkssturm eingezogen.
I was called up to join the Home Guard. At night after work, we had to go to the town hall and learn from diagrams what the inside and outside of a bazooka looked like. This went on until we knew everything about the bazooka and how it worked.
So lange, bis wir das Innenleben dieser Panzerfaust wirklich voll integriert hatten und wussten, wie geht der Panzerfaust. Es war irgendwo auch ein Ehrgeiz.
I think I was ambitious, but I don't think I expected to die for Hitler. We wanted to fight the people who were hurting us so much. If you can only imagine how much I hated those people, the ones who were bombing us. If they'd come to Stuttgart, I would have fired my bazooka at them.
Like the boys of the Hitler Youth, the BDM girls had been drawn in to fighting Hitler's increasingly desperate war. But he would still ask them to make one final sacrifice. The final months of the war saw millions of young men die on the battlefield. Germany was now facing a population crisis. The Third Reich looked to the BDM girls to provide the armies of the future. The strict moral code of the 1930s was collapsing. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, had already set up Nazi maternity homes for a very specific purpose.
Rassisch und erbbiologisch wertvolle werdende Mütter unterzubringen und zu betreuen, bei denen nach sorgfältiger Prüfung der eigenen Familie und der Familie des Erzeugers anzunehmen ist, dass gleich wertvolle Kinder zur Welt kommen.
In fact, these were maternity homes for unmarried mothers. They were called the Lebensborn, the source of life. Their purpose quickly became shrouded in myth.
She was a leader in the BDM. She was away for a while and came back pregnant, although she was unmarried and didn't ever marry. They said she went to the Lebensborn and gave the Führer a child.
Women without a man who wanted a child went there for 3 weeks to the handsome studs, the blonde Teutonic German giants, and if they were lucky, they became pregnant.
There was an element of truth in these rumors, and some BDM girls had no choice in the matter.
Meine Schwester war in einem Mädchenlager untergebracht und
My sister was in a BDM camp, and there was a boys' camp right next door.
Die Leiter von beiden Lagern.
One night, the directors of both camps opened the doors and windows of the girls' dorm when the girls had already gone to bed. Then they sent the Labour Service boys over to the girls' camp, and of course they went for it.
Mädchenlager geschickt und die fielen dann natürlich über die Mädchen her.
As the Red Army advanced towards Berlin, the BDM girls faced the wrath of soldiers bent on revenge.
In diesen von deutschen Truppen wiedereroberten Orten ist jedes Haus von den Grausamkeiten bolschewistischer Soldateska gezeichnet. Die Bestialitäten sind zu ungeheuerlich, als dass alles gezeigt werden könnte, was die Kamera festhielt.
For once, Hitler's propaganda machine was telling the truth.
I was on the run for months. You have no idea. They hunted us like rabbits. They came night after night and smashed our doors in. They said, "Where woman, I want to..." I won't say the word, but I can still hear the women screaming.
I thought the soldier was going to shoot me. I didn't know the facts of life. In a way, I was grateful. I was glad to be alive. But of course, it was terrible.
As Berlin fell, Hitler committed suicide.
Aus dem Führerhauptquartier wird gemeldet, dass unser Führer Adolf Hitler heute Nachmittag in seinem Befehlsstand in der Reichskanzlei bis zum letzten Atemzuge gegen den Bolschewismus kämpfend für Deutschland gefallen ist.
I wept uncontrollably. It seems inconceivable today. It was as if a close relative had died.
BDM girls were distraught.
My world fell apart. I loved being in the BDM and its junior section. Everything else was a different matter. I never understood that the two things went together.
Dass das zusammengehört, habe ich nie begriffen.
After the death of Hitler, the ordeal continued for many BDM girls. They were ordered to visit concentration camps to see what had been done in their name.
Schuldig von etwas Schlechtem.
We were guilty of being enthusiastic about something bad and applauding it. I feel that is a type of guilt.
How much the German people really knew about the Holocaust is still disputed today.
We didn't know about anything. That's what I can't understand or grasp. Perhaps I don't want to. People still say, you must have known. We didn't.
We knew about concentration camps and torture. We knew they made lampshades from human skin. We knew they pulled people's gold fillings out. I knew all that at 12.
Ich wusste das alles mit 12.
We didn't know, and no one believes us. It's so terrible. Of course, our knowing wouldn't have changed anything. I'd have lost my idealism even earlier, but I wouldn't have been able to change anything.
Many BDM girls are still struggling to come to terms with what they once believed.
Of course, one doesn't feel free of guilt. But on the other hand, one tells oneself that we were abused as children. But we didn't even realize we were being abused. We thought that what we'd been trained to believe was true.
Geglaubt, dass das wahr ist, woran wir zu glauben gewöhnt wurden. Erkennen müssen, dass man an
Having to recognize that we'd believed in a false ideal, that the whole thing was a fraud, and that we'd simply been abused. That really hurts.
Einfach missbraucht worden ist, das tut furchtbar weh.
The BDM girls had dedicated their childhood to serving Hitler. 60 years later, the legacy of Nazi Germany continues to haunt them. From the first days of Nazi rule, education was central to Hitler's thinking. Throughout Germany, schoolchildren were taught about the superiority of the Aryan race and how the Third Reich would dominate the world for 1,000 years.
Was wir vom kommenden Deutschland ersehnen und erwarten, das müsst ihr, meine Jungens, erfüllen.
Nazi leaders quickly realized that normal schools would not be sufficient to groom the future rulers of the 1,000-year Reich. They decided to establish selective schools to create a new elite.
We were to be the future political leaders of Germany. That was the school's goal.
The schools were run like army barracks. War games were as common as traditional lessons, and the boys were pushed to their physical limits.
Toughness was the order of the day. Any display of weakness was despised. There was no pity.
Boys were taken on school outings to Jewish ghettos and concentration camps.
Trust no fox in the woods. Trust no Jew on his oath. That was essentially it. The evil Jew kept turning up. For us, it was a given that Jews were evil.
This is the story of Hitler's elite schools, the breeding grounds for the next generation of Nazi rulers. In April 1933, Hitler received a unique birthday present. The Nazi Education Ministry created a new type of school. They called them Institutions of National and Political Education, NAPOLEs for short.
They wanted to mold political fighters on the basis of National Socialist ideology. Men who could later be used to work in all areas of the state and society.
The Napole boys would be the vanguard of Hitler's new Aryan master race and central to his plan of spreading Nazi ideology around the world.
In diese Schulen, da holen wir die talentierten Kinder hinein. Die Kinder unserer breiten Masse. Arbeitersöhne, Bauernsöhne, wo die Eltern niemals es bezahlen könnten, dass ihre Kinder ein höheres Studium mitmachen. Wir haben ein fast fantastisch anmutendes Ziel. Uns schwebt ein Staat vor in der Zukunft, bei dem jede Stelle vom fähigsten Sohn unseres Volkes besetzt sein soll. Ein Staat, in dem Geburt gar nicht ist und Leistung und Können alles.
It was Hitler's intention that the Napole boys would become the new ruling class of Europe. They were destined for the top jobs in politics, industry, and above all, the military.
You're the best, they said. The word elite came up a lot. They wanted to motivate us. You're the elite, the hope for the future.
The job for our class was Gauleiter in Siberia. That was drummed into us.
Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, took a personal interest in the Napole schools. Himmler was already using military academies to turn young men into elite SS fighters. Now he planned to use the Napolas as feeder schools. He was determined to attract the very best pupils.
Listen, my boy. The Führer is starting a new school. You're doing well and your parents are Nazis. They want children like that. You'd love it, my little Aryan flag bearer.
Das wäre doch was für dich, mein Wimpelträgerchen.
Candidates had to attend selection camps that were more about physical determination and courage than intellectual prowess. Admission to the schools was seen as a great honor.
Ich war natürlich gewaltig stolz, das konnte man in der Schulklasse.
Of course, I was very proud. I could tell my classmates, and I was happy my parents were pleased. I won't say I was quite in seventh heaven, but I was immensely happy I'd passed the difficult tests.
Schwierige Prüfung bestanden hatte.
Boys were drilled to believe they were part of an elite new breed.
Wir tragen stolz des Führers Namen.
We proudly bear Hitler's name and want to be the very best. No one asks where we're from. What matters is the boy alone. The half-hearted are left behind. We sing and march in step.
If the Aryan race is the best, and the German people are the best of the Aryan race, and if we're the best of the Germans, then we're the best in the world.
Die Besten von der ganzen Welt.
Arriving at school was a shock to the boys, many of whom had never before spent time away from home. The new clothes were like an army uniform, and classes were called platoons.
The first thing we had to learn was to obey. This was supposedly because only someone who can obey can give orders.
There were frequent dormitory checks, kit inspections, and flag days.
Marschiert wurde von früh bis Abend.
We marched from morning till night. After we were woken up, we went to the yard and lined up for early morning sport. We did sport together and then showered. Then we got dressed, lined up, and marched to breakfast. Then we went to our rooms, lined up again, and marched to our lessons.
Die Stuben, dann wurde wieder angetreten, dann wurde zum Unterricht marschiert.
The discipline was designed to break down individuality.
Du bist nichts, dein Volk ist alles, ja.
You're nothing. Your nation is everything. The individual no longer counted. The only thing that counted was the community, which marched to prescribed rules.
The philosophy was simple. Everyone should learn both to give and to obey orders. Boys dealt harshly with anyone who wouldn't conform.
Dieser Schüler wurde dann von uns
We beat up one boy. I can still see the red wheels on his back because we hit him with our leather belts.
weil wir mit unseren Lederriemen auf ihn einschlugen.
Tests of courage became part of the daily routine.
Wenn man Schwäche zeigte, dann war man
If you showed weakness, you were a sissy, a coward, a disgrace to the whole squad or the whole legion.
Zuges oder der ganzen Hundertschaft.
We had to jump off a 10-meter board, fully equipped with rucksack and helmet. When you hit the surface of the water, the helmet's chin strap would almost rip your head off.
Festgeschnallt, dann hat es ihnen fast den Kopf abgerissen.
Also los. Leg die Arme fest an den Körper und dann senkrecht unter wie eine Kerze.
Ich möchte bitte lieber nicht.
Na, spring schon. Du brauchst doch keine Angst zu haben.
Ja, wir kriegten den Befehl, spring.
We were given the order, jump. First, I had to find the courage to jump into the unknown. Second, I had to trust that the person giving the order wouldn't let me jump to my death, unless it was absolutely necessary. That might happen later, when I was a soldier.
Sein können, wenn ich später älter Soldat gewesen wäre.
Boxing was seen as the perfect test of brain and brawn.
Die körperliche Belastbarkeit wurde bis an die Grenze getrieben.
When we boxed, boys from older squads were often brought in. The physical difference between 12 and 14-year-olds are huge. It really beat us up. It was all about toughness.
Nur härteorientiert.
By 1937, Himmler's stranglehold on the Napoles was almost total. But other leading Nazis had grown jealous. By 1937, senior Nazis had begun to distrust the SS influence over the Napoles schools. In response, the Nazis' head of organization, Robert Ley, founded the Adolf Hitler schools.
Wenn Sie mich fragen, was wird, so ist das genauso, als wenn Sie ein Samenkorn fragen, was aus ihm wird. Ja, das wächst. Die Arbeit geht weiter. Das ist mal klar, nicht wahr? Wir werden uns nicht auf unseren alten Teil zurückziehen, auch keinen Lorbeerkranz ums Haupt winden. Die Arbeit geht weiter.
The Adolf Hitler schools were designed to produce politicians, not soldiers.
We were to be loyal followers of Hitler and faithful Nazis. Independent thinkers with our own will who could assert ourselves and make decisions. That wasn't possible, of course. You can't be a loyal Nazi and also think critically.
Robert Ley himself set a poor example to the boys.
Es war Tatsache, dass oft bei seinen Reden auf den großen...
It was a fact that during his speeches in the courtyard, he was often drunk. He kept on saying the same old things. You're lucky, you've got it good. It's nice here.
Ihr habt's gut, ihr habt's schön.
Das war das Aufregendste, was ich eigentlich auf der Schule...
The most exciting thing that happened to me at school was when Wolfgang Dreyer from Hamburg, School 9, suddenly stood up and said, Reichlieder, did you know that people think you're a drunk? Then Robert Ley slumped a little and said, rather quietly, boys, you can do anything, just don't become drinkers.
Ihr dürft alles werden, eins nicht, Trinker.
The Adolf Hitler schoolboys were showered with special privileges. They wanted for nothing.
Es wurde uns viel geboten an Reisen.
We had a lot of opportunities, trips, maneuvers, as we called them. We could go skiing, and we went to the Alps and the lakes. That was unusual for a boy in those days.
If you want to seduce, you must offer seductive things. That happened to us. We were seduced very cleverly.
The most exclusive of all the elite schools was the Reichsschule at Feldafing near Munich. Here, boys boarded in mansions abandoned by wealthy Jewish businessmen.
Das waren also Villen von jüdischen Eigentümern, die entweder...
They were mansions that used to be owned by Jews. They had either sold up because of the pressure of the boycott on April 1st, 1933, when it didn't look as though they could stay, or they'd fled the country without selling.
Das weiter gesucht haben.
The Reichsschule at Feldafing became home to the sons of high-ranking Nazi officials. These boys were promised glittering futures and were dismissive of the other elite schools.
Wir haben immer gesagt, Napola.
We always said Napola, Napola, or Adolf Hitler schools? Oh, please. We thought they were so far below us. We regarded ourselves as the best of the party schools.
In all Hitler's schools, lessons were taught within the context of Nazi philosophy. So maths was reborn as the science of war.
A plane flying at an altitude of 2,000 meters and a speed of 108 kilometers per hour drops a bomb on Warsaw. When and where does the bomb hit the ground?
In history, the main topic was the Treaty of Versailles, the peace settlement that humiliated Germany at the end of the First World War.
An diesen sogenannten Schandfrieden wurden wir immer wieder erinnert.
We were constantly reminded of that shameful peace because we had to recover the territories that were lost in 1918 and 1919. We definitely had to get them back. It was our duty to ensure we recovered them.
Diese Gebiete zurückzubekommen.
Hitler's schoolboys also had to learn languages to be ready one day to rule over the greater German Empire.
We were to be sophisticated, multilingual. I remember a teacher joking, "You're nothing until you speak 10 Arabic dialects without a trace of German accent."
Boys were meant to be as confident on the dance floor as on the battlefield.
Boys, I want you to be able to say, "Kiss my ass," as easily as you say, "My dear lady."
The future leaders of Germany were expected to gain experience of working in industry and on the land. The idea was to acquire an understanding of the workers they would one day control. Conversations with farmers raised some difficult questions.
What is it like now the Jews have gone? The farmer said, "Bad, the livestock trade has collapsed." Our student said he shouldn't take such a narrow view, but should think of the underlying principle. We didn't know enough to argue the practical points.
Although the elite Nazi schools boasted of excellence, educational standards were poor. At selection camps, teachers were handpicked for their commitment to National Socialism rather than their intellectual ability.
Das ist eines der Haupterziehungsmittel überhaupt gewesen, uns.
One of the main educational methods was to instill in us absolute punctuality, absolute discipline and absolute obedience.
Zu unabdingbarem Gehorsam.
Of course, as teachers, we had to pass this on to our pupils.
Natürlich auch weiter zu vermitteln hätten an unsere Schüler.
Ich habe deutlich gemerkt, dass die Erzieher, die wir hatten,
It was clear that our teachers were recruited from the Hitler Youth. They were good comrades and had the best intentions, but not enough knowledge. So, by today's standards, I think we were poorly educated.
ein bisschen Provinz. Ich muss mich schämen, wie wenig wir über deutsche Literatur.
I'm ashamed of how little we knew about German writers and poets, from Mann to Ben, and how poor our knowledge of mathematics was when I compare it with my grandchildren today. Intellectually, it was a poor result.
Geistigen Gebiet ein trauriger Abschluss gewesen.
Teachers attempted to instruct the boys in party policy.
My God, we couldn't care less about party policy. We were Nazis. For us, National Socialism was something else altogether. It was much more than purely party policy.
The son of leading Nazi Martin Bormann had to ask his father for clarification.
Vati, jetzt sag mir mal, was ist eigentlich Nationalsozialismus?
Dad, tell me, what is National Socialism? And that was after 3 years of instruction on Mein Kampf and party policy. My father was clearly quite surprised by the question. His answer was a sentence that hit the nail on the head. National Socialism is the Führer's will, full stop. He dictates the full stop, too.
All pupils were trained to follow the Führer's orders to the letter. They learned his speeches word for word and carried his photograph in their breast pocket.
Die Erde ist ein Wanderpokal. Die Erde ist nicht für feige Völker da, nicht für Schwache und nicht für Faule, sondern die Erde ist da für denjenigen, der sie sich nimmt.
Hitler's academies had been loosely modelled on the British public school system. There was even a visit to one school by a class from Eton.
Ich finde es sehr schön. Vieles ist noch fremd für mich.
Ja, und es ist eine sehr gute Gelegenheit, sich kennenzulernen. Nannik, ich meine, wir kommen doch gut aus miteinander.
Ja, gewiss.
At the German school, boys noticed how different the Etonians were.
Sie hatten einen Hauch von Eleganz, den wir nicht hatten.
They had a touch of elegance that we didn't have. They were relaxed and we weren't. We were the ones who marched in squads, one squad behind the other, across the parade ground.
Durch den schönen Hof marschierten.
And the Eton boys, who were visiting us, stood on the other side, leaning casually on the railing, probably saying, "What idiots."
Ganz lässig über die Balustrade gelehnt.
They were gentlemanlike. We were already little soldiers.
Wohin wir schon kleine Soldaten waren.
One subject came to dominate Hitler's classrooms more than any other. The problem of what to do with the Jews. One of the defining principles of Nazi ideology was racial purity. Race dominated Hitler's elite schools. Before pupils were allowed in, there were strict selection procedures.
We had to prove our racial purity back to 1800. That was a big problem for me because in the first half of the 19th century, some church records were burnt. So there were gaps in my family tree. It was a real shock for me not to be accepted immediately. Instead, I had to have about 8 photos of me taken from different angles. They were sent to the SS Reich Security Office in Berlin, which had a race office. Several months later, I was incredibly relieved to hear, "You are Aryan. It's okay."
Bist arisch, es reicht.
From the very start of Nazi rule, all German school children were taught about race. Books and magazines were written especially for children by one of Hitler's earliest supporters, Julius Streicher.
Pflanzt es in die Jugend hinein das Wissen, dass am Juden die ganze Menschheit zugrunde geht. Erzieht die Kinder zu einem gesunden Hass, zu einem gesunden Zorn. Sagt den Kindern jawohl mit der Peitsche. Hat sie hinausgehauen. Erzeugt diesen Hass.
Trust no fox in the woods. Trust no Jew on his oath. That was essentially it. The evil Jew kept turning up. For us, it was a given that Jews were evil.
At first, some teachers refused to conform.
We had one teacher who'd say, "Cross out the next sentence. Don't learn the next sentence."
Put brackets around that. It's nonsense. We worked through the whole book like that at school.
In 1935, all teachers were placed directly under party control. They were told that the Jewish problem should now be the focus in the classroom.
The teachers always attacked the Jews. In our history lessons, we also had racial science, where we were told that the Aryan race was better.
This so-called racial science was used to prove the inferiority of the Jewish race.
Ich hatte dort das Problem, dass ein Lehrer mich vor die Klasse zitierte und sagte.
A teacher called me out to the front of the class and said, "Do you know what a bastard is?" We had heard about bastards in our biology class. Then he said, "This boy, his mother is Jewish. That says it all."
Das sagt ja wohl alles. Und da habe ich mich sehr gewundert.
I was very surprised that my classmates didn't react all that much.
Reagiert haben.
Children were forced to face a panel of SS medical staff.
So, jetzt mach mal die Augen ganz groß auf und schaust mich an. Ja. Georg Weber, Augenfarbe 2a.
Das waren SS-Ärzte?
SS doctors visited the school. Tables were set up in the gymnasium. We were weighed and our skulls were measured. Then we were classified.
Ich war eben Arash 2, während also mein...
I was Aryan 2. My best friend had a skull like old Hindenburg, so he was Phalian. You were classified as Phalian, Dinaric, Eastern, and so on.
Oder so war.
Wenn ich mich umschaute in der eigenen Jahrgangsgemeinschaft.
When I looked around at the boys in my year, we certainly weren't all ideal Aryan types. There were plenty of boys with round Saxon heads or Bavarian Dinaric profiles with a hooked nose.
Mit Hakennase.
In Hitler's schools, it wasn't only the Jews who were unacceptable.
Ich kenne einen Fall.
I know one case of a boy with a round skull and face. I don't want to mention his name. He had to leave the school. They said he was pure Eastern.
In Latin lessons, boys were taught how the Roman Empire dealt with Jews. But the Holocaust was never mentioned.
Bis wir dran sind, die Führung zu übernehmen.
We thought, by the time it's our turn to be the leaders, the Jewish problem will be solved. Germany will be free of Jews. There won't be any left. But we didn't think about Auschwitz, or about Jews being gassed. We wouldn't have been able to imagine that being done. Throwing them out, yes, but killing them, the master race wouldn't do it. It wasn't gentlemanly. It didn't fit the picture at all. We were idealists.
Anti-Semitism was explained and justified as an historical phenomenon. We were told about the pogroms in Worms, Speyer and Vienna. It was obvious the Jews were evil. We didn't know why, just that they had always been like that, and they'd always lived in ghettos.
In August 1941, a group of boys from Annapolis School were taken on a trip to a ghetto in the Polish town of Łódź, then called Litzmannstadt.
Wir haben nie gelernt.
We were never taught. It wasn't in the curriculum.
that one of the reasons we're put on this earth is to help those weaker than ourselves.
The class teacher wrote,
On the 14th and 15th, we were guests in Litzmannstadt. Our boys were delighted with the ghetto.
Boys were also taught about concentration camps. Some called them concert camps.
Ich hatte gehört von einem Konzertlager.
I'd heard of a concert camp. I called it that. The people who went there were completely pig-headed and couldn't stand our Adolf at all, even though he wanted to do good for our people. That's what we thought.
Doch, da machen wir wenig Federlesen. Die kommen zu ihrer weiteren Ausbildung in ein Konzertlager, wo man ihnen dann so lange die Flötentöne beibringt, bis sie sich an eine taktvolle Mitarbeit gewöhnt haben.
Pupils from the Adolf Hitler School in Thuringia were taken on a class outing to the concentration camp at Buchenwald.
We went there by bus. We saw the gates with the words, "To each his own." We were introduced to Dutch researchers who were experimenting on shrunken heads.
They were the heads of Polish prisoners.
Man hat uns erzählt, dass in den niederländischen Kolonien
We were told that in the Dutch colonies the headhunters did experiments on their beheaded enemies, and that Dutch researchers were continuing this work. For what purpose? I've no idea.
Keine Ahnung. Wir haben gefragt, was das für Schornsteine sind, und uns wurde gesagt,
We asked what the chimneys were, and were told it was a crematorium. As if anticipating our question, they said, "We have as many people here as in Weimar, about 50,000. Weimar has a crematorium, so do we. Of course we have losses, in other words, deaths." We were satisfied with that.
Damit gaben wir uns zufrieden.
While the full horror of Buchenwald was kept from the schoolboys, they accepted the existence of concentration camps.
All das haben wir verdaut unter der Überschrift.
We dealt with it by saying, they are enemies of our people. While we're at war, we have to isolate them here.
Aussondern müssen. Das größte Verbrechen eigentlich, was an uns...
Actually, the greatest crime that we were subjected to was that they eliminated any capacity for pity.
Vollkommen ausgeschaltet wurde.
We were to be capable of thinking, but not able to feel pity.
Mitleiden sollten wir nach
I'd say they succeeded in that.
sagen, das ist der Erziehung gelungen.
There was no place for religion in Nazi Germany. It was swiftly removed from the curriculum. By 1942, only 1 in 4 of Hitler's schoolboys believed in God. Instead, there was a new faith, the cult of Hitler.
There was no God, but Providence gave us the Führer.
Ich selber habe ihn nie gesehen. I never saw him myself. Once I was on the Autobahn from Salzburg to Munich and his convoys sped past us in the opposite direction. I never got any closer to him than that. A blurred, shadowy figure behind the glass. And that's basically what he was like. Far away.
Das war auch im Alltag im Grund. Ganz weit weg.
Hitler's schoolboys were determined to get close to their Führer. They lined parade routes for hours, desperate for a glimpse of their hero.
An dem Abend habe ich meinen Eltern nach Hause geschrieben.
That evening I wrote home to my parents. I saw the Führer. He walked past me. I so wanted him to look at me, but he just looked straight ahead, and I was very disappointed that he didn't look at me. We were devoted to him.
Man sah dann immer diese Fotos, wo sich...
We always saw photos of him spending time with other boys, stroking a small child's cheek, putting his hand on an older boy's shoulder or on his cap. We'd have liked that. After all, we were Adolf Hitler schoolboys. We bore his name.
Wir waren schließlich Adolf Hitler Schüler. Wir trugen seinen Namen.
Nazi philosophy demanded complete subordination to the Führer's will. Attendance at somber ceremonies, where fallen Nazi heroes were commemorated, was compulsory for schoolboys. Specially composed verses promoted the idea of a glorious martyrdom.
Besitz stirbt.
Possessions die. Families die. You yourself will die like them. There is one thing that lives forever, the glory of dead men's deeds.
This was a lesson reinforced by the school's military regimes.
Im Geländesprung auf Marsch, Marsch.
In obstacle jumping, it was get up, march, march, lie down, jump up, march until we were panting. Or there was fancy dress, where you had to get changed.
Line up in full marching order in 10 minutes.
Then we were dismissed and told to come back in other different clothes.
Ad nauseam, at least 5 or 6 times a week.
Schools conducted their own war games with reconnaissance troops and advance units. The climax was the final battle.
We died in the field games too. We had ribbons of life. When they were torn off, it meant the boy was dead.
Pupils didn't have real weapons, but at Napola schools, boys were presented with a dagger engraved with the school motto, "Be more than you seem."
We were very proud when we got the dagger. It was like a kind of initiation into manhood, like in a primitive society. But it worked.
Ich überreiche dir als äußeres Zeichen, dass du nunmehr vollständig zu unserer Gemeinschaft gehörst. Diese Waffe.
Each dagger was also engraved with a personal message.
Mine was, only real men have the strength to pit themselves against a hostile world. It came from Joseph Goebbels.
Wenn einer von uns fallen soll, der andere steht für 2.
Wenn einer von uns fallen soll, der andere steht für 2.
Denn jedem Kämpfer gab ein Gott den Kameraden bei.
Ich habe einen Kameraden gehabt, der nicht so ganz mitkam.
I had a comrade who wasn't really part of community life and felt somewhat rejected. One night he went out into the castle garden and stabbed himself with the dagger. He committed suicide with his dagger of honor.
The system was designed to push the boys to breaking point. Only this way could the regime identify the very strongest.
You had to test yourself. If I didn't want to do something, I'd ask myself, do we always have to stand up straight, and so on? Yes, you do. It's your duty to your school, your Führer, and your people.
When the time finally came for troops to fight, boys still at school were afraid they might miss the action.
After France in 1940, our teacher said, the war will be over before your final exams. We all thought, what a nightmare.
We thought, God, they're lucky, they've made it. And we somehow felt that our turn would come too. Kommen wir auch mal dran.
The schools promoted an idealized version of war. Old boys returning from the front gave talks which they'd embellish with tales of personal heroism.
Es gab ein furchtbares Panzergefecht zwischen deutschen Panzern und Russenpanzern. Die Granaten zischten über meinen Kopf hinweg, von rückwärts und vorwärts. Entgegengaben wirften über meinen Kopf. Jetzt ließ das Feuer wieder einstellen, griff zum Karabiner, denn jetzt wurden mir die russischen Infanteristen wieder von hinten gefährlich. Sie stürmten zurück und ich legte an. Jetzt hieß es nun nur noch sicheres Auge und starke Hand, ruhig Blut und fester Stand. Ich legte an und habe nur die Russen, die auf mein Lob von hinten drauf zukamen, umgelegt.
Dann haben wir die immer bewundert, was das für Helden sind.
We wondered what it was like to be a hero, but thought we'd probably miss out on the war. They said, "Don't be sad, young comrades. We won't be dragging the war out until you're old enough. But after our final victory, there'll still be plenty to do."
Aber es gibt auch danach noch genug zu tun.
Hölderlin, Hyperion.
In Hölderlin's poem Hyperion, it says, "Messengers of victory descend, the battle is ours. Don't count the dead, not one was lost in vain." That's how they talk. Of course, no one mentioned being shot in the stomach and dying a miserable death.
As German casualties mounted, more and more of the elite schoolboys saw action. In March 1944, the head of the Napola schools reported to Himmler.
The next generation of young leaders has now proved itself against the enemy. 4 are wearing the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, 33 the Knight's Cross, 96 the Gold German Cross, and 1,226 were killed or missing in action.
Am Anfang waren wir stolz. Am Anfang.
At the beginning, we were proud to give our lives for Germany. That's how we saw it.
So dachten wir damals. Dann wurden wir
Then we were distressed because younger men who had been our older comrades at school were dying.
Jüngere, die wir noch als Gruppenführer oder überhaupt als ältere Kameraden in der
And it wasn't just our comrades who were dying. It was our fathers too.
Kameraden, es fielen auch unsere Väter.
In spring 1945, reinforcements were urgently needed when Berlin came under attack. Most of the senior boys from the Potsdam Napola school were drafted to the front. Their commander was August Heissmeyer, head of the Napola schools. He rallied them with stirring words.
Der Führer ist in Berlin und ihr
The Führer is in Berlin. You must be loyal to him. Wenck's army is on its way. In 24, or at the most 48 hours, we'll turn destiny around.
Heissmeyer fled Berlin shortly afterwards, leaving the boys to face a ferocious Red Army assault.
I begged my comrades to take me with them. I couldn't keep going. I was wounded and it was everyone for himself. I said to one boy, "I have a compass. Show me." I showed him. "Give it to me," he said. I said, "No, let me come with you, it's mine." "Give it to me or," he said, with his gun in his hand.
Towards the end of the war, a group of Adolf Hitler schoolboys joined the Werewolves, an undercover movement dedicated to sabotage deep behind enemy lines.
Hier spricht der Sender Werwolf, der Sender der Deutschen Freiheitsbewegung in den
The movement had its own radio station to broadcast its successes to the nation. In February 1945, 2 Adolf Hitler schoolboys, both undercover werewolves, were caught spying on American troop movements. They were found guilty of espionage and handed the maximum sentence, death by firing squad. They were 16 and 17.
Up to the end of the war, I was learning to die for my fatherland, but I didn't learn to live for it. Our thinking was, you're nothing, your people are everything. Germany must live, even if we must die. Germany, you will shine, even if we die.
Many of the elite schoolboys ended up in prisoner of war camps, but they still dreamed that Germany would triumph.
Ich war schon in Gefangenschaft. Ein strahlender Maitag.
I was a prisoner of war. It was a beautiful day in May, with a slight breeze in a steel blue summer sky. A kind of air wave came along. I don't know what it was, but in my disappointment on the one hand and gullibility on the other, I thought it was the last ridge of a pressure wave from a miracle weapon. The air had to come from somewhere.
Irgendwo muss ja dieser Windzug herkommen.
Eigentlich war das nicht richtig, wie die zusammenbrach. Also so von uns.
From our point of view, the end was all wrong. It just wasn't the way things should have been done. There was no announcement and no Heil Hitler. There was no last roll call like the one we'd read about in the Spanish Civil War. It was simply, boys, the war's over, go home.
Das Ende geht heim. Geht nach Hause.
It was only later that the boys began to realize what their education had been for.
All those things they'd done to us had a specific aim. And that aim, it becomes clearer to me every year, was a hero's death.
Hitler's elite school system had achieved its goal in molding a generation of boys who fought with a blind allegiance to their Führer and an absolute belief in his cause. Many are still bitter about what they were taught.
Betrogen und missbraucht wurden vor allen Dingen die, die es nicht überlebt haben.
The cheated and exploited ones are those who didn't survive. That was about half of us. But anyone who did survive should admit his own stupidity and try to do better with his children and grandchildren.
Besser zu machen.
When Germany went to war in 1939, 4 out of 5 of the country's children were members of the Hitler Youth. From the age of 10, they had learned Nazi ideology and military tactics in Hitler Youth clubhouses and boot camps. The boys had been well prepared for war.
At that age, you can't imagine death properly. You don't have a real sense of fear. We would have laid down our lives for Germany. In other words, for Hitler.
Für Deutschland. Grob gesagt sogar für Hitler.
At the beginning of the war, the Hitler Youth were put to work on the home front. Boys manned the flak guns, and the Hitler Youth Fire Brigade fought the daily blazes. The very young, Hitler's most precious commodity, were evacuated to army-style camps, where they fell under the influence of SS officers. In the final years of the war, as German casualties mounted, Hitler would look to his youth movement for reinforcements.
It was dangerous to be aged 18 in those days. One of us lost an eye, another an arm. In all, we had losses of nearly 50%.
We were driven into a war and used as cannon fodder, in a way that makes a mockery of every military principle. We were expendable.
Hitler's children were going to war. On the 1st of September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. The Wehrmacht, the German army, used Hitler Youth boys to take messages to frontline troops. One boy proud to wear the Wehrmacht armband was 16-year-old Werner Gottschall.
I rode around on my bicycle all day, holding my left arm out in front of me so everyone could see that Werner Gottschall is in the German army.
But the reality of war was very different from the glorified version the Hitler Youth boys had been taught.
I was crying and screaming and shaking so much that I had to push my bike to the local headquarters. I couldn't ride. I was so unnerved by the din and the dust and the rubble and the houses that were gone and the roofs on the street. It was dreadful.
By the 27th of September, Warsaw had fallen. The campaign had claimed more than 90,000 Polish lives.
Wir mussten die ganze Westerplatte ablaufen, das polnische Gebiet.
We scoured Westerplatte in Polish territory to register the dead and attend to the injured. There were so many sad sights. I hadn't seen dead people before except at funerals laid out in a coffin, but these lay on the ground, dirty and bloody. It was an experience that took me a long, long time to get over.
Lange gebraucht, damit fertig zu werden.
Die deutsche Jugend aber wird strahlenden Herzens ohnehin erfüllen, was die Nation, der nationalsozialistische Staat von ihr erwartet und fordert.
Away from the front line, the Hitler Youth were used to plug the gaps left by men who had gone to war. Boys and girls were sent to work across Germany, in fields and factories.
Im Krieg zählt eines jeden Hand und wir verzichten gerne auf Luxus, Launen und auf Tanz. Ob jung, ob alt, ob Frau, ob Mann, auf jeden kommt es heute an.
In 1940, the Hitler Youth leadership reported that more than 5 million teenagers were working as part of the war effort. Without them, the German economy would have collapsed. Younger Hitler Youth members also wanted to help.
We collected for the Winter Relief Fund. We had to publicize it so that people would give generously. We were each allocated a doorway in the marketplace. When a whistle was blown, we yelled rhymes like, "People in your purse dig deep. Make sure you donate to Winter Relief." Or a macabre slogan, "Go on, people, donate a lot. If you don't, you'll be shot."
These Hitler Youth boys were promised a more active role in the future by the Nazi leadership.
Pimpe aus Weida in Thüringen sammelten, wo immer sie Glück hatten, bei Bekannten und in Geschäften, 5000 Zigaretten und sandten sie an Generalfeldmarschall Rommel nach Afrika. Heute kommt die Antwort. Rommel schickt dem Pimpen zum Dank eine englische Beuteuniform, sein Bild und einen Brief. Liebe Jungs, schreibt der Generalfeldmarschall, ihr selbst werdet einmal eure Pflicht als Soldaten erfüllen. Ich hoffe, dass ihr euch dann den Geist, der euch heute beseelt, erhalten habt.
Vorbereitet waren wir alle innerlich.
We were all mentally prepared. When the war broke out, our school teacher said to us, "You'll all get a go. You'll get a go." We were young and thought the war would soon be over, but we really hoped we would get a go. I had a friend who said in all seriousness, "I want to die in battle."
Ich hatte einen Freund, der sagte allen Ernstes zu mir, "Weißt du, ich möchte fallen."
Not all young people wanted to fight Hitler's war. In Hamburg, fans of swing music congregated at private parties.
Swing music represented a boundless freedom. Think of the times we lived in. Young people were restricted by the state. The state dictated to them what they could listen to and what they couldn't. You must also bear in mind that it was wartime. Cigarettes and food were rationed. Young people were called up. When they played swing music with their friends for a few hours, they forgot all the misery around them.
Fans of swing associated the music with the American way of life. It was a million miles away from the regimented discipline of the Hitler Youth.
Dem Gesetz der Rhythmen können wir Menschen uns nicht entziehen. Jede Militärkapelle zwingt uns, wir wollen oder nicht, im gleichen Schritt mitzumarschieren. Es kostet uns Mühe, gegen den Rhythmus der Musik anzugehen.
Der deutsche Junge.
A German boy had to be a loyal German. Loyalty is the mark of honor. That was the motto of the SS, but also of the Hitler Youth. In those days, there was a swing song called the Flatfoot Flugie.
Swingtitel. Der hieß The Flatfoot Flugie.
It's a nonsensical title. It doesn't really mean anything. When it was dark, my swing friends and I used to walk along the Jungfernsteg in Hamburg with an umbrella, 1 foot on the curb, 1 foot on the road, singing.
Regenschirm und dann immer mit einem Fuß auf dem Bordstein, mit dem anderen Fuß auf der Fahrbahn und dann the Flatfoot Flugie.
The Flatfoot Flugie with the Floyd joy.
Fly, fly, the Flatfoot Flugie with the fly, fly, treu, Deutsch, treu.
Loyal German, loyal German, loyal German. The first time I remember thinking, are you allowed to say anything so facetious? I found it really hard to do.
Das ist mir schwer gefallen, das zu machen.
The Flatfoot Flugie with the fly, fly. The Flatfoot Flugie with the fly, fly. The Flatfoot Flugie.
The Nazis disapproved of swing.
A dictatorship needs the young to be soldiers. Then along came these youngsters who looked totally unmilitary in their check suits and crepe-soled shoes and with long hair. Besides, a lot of swing music was played by blacks, and it had its roots in Africa.
Oder in USA.
In 1942, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, wrote to his deputy Reinhard Heydrich, saying that swing fans are degenerate and should be sent to concentration camps.
We knew there were concentration camps. We thought you went there, worked and got your food. But that you died there and starved. We didn't know that.
Over 1,000 young German men were sent to the youth protection camp at Moringen. Here they were tortured, and more than 150 were executed on charges of high treason. On the 11th of May 1940, Allied leaders took the decision to bomb German cities. Within hours, the first bombs were falling on Berlin, Hamburg and Hanover. Over the next 4 years, Allied bombers brought terror to German civilians.
In that air raid shelter, I saw women throw themselves on the ground and scream, pray and panic when the light flickered and the fresh air pipe rattled. We could hear the rumbling of the bombers as they got nearer, and the detonations came and then died away. Then came the next wave, and then the next.
By 1944, the raids were happening every night.
Und dann saß man unten im Luftschutzkeller. Und da habe ich Leute gesehen, die hatten...
Then we sat in the air raid shelter. I saw men who were covered in war medals, close combat awards, everything. Sergeants and officers too, who were utterly terror-stricken. They shook with fear. At the front, you knew where the enemy was. But being in the cellar of an 8-story house that could collapse on you at any moment felt like the most terrifying experience anyone could go through. It was the same for me. I was scared shitless.
Hitler rallied the nation.
Zunächst steht auf der Welt das Gesetz der Auslese. Und der Kräftigere und der Gesündere, der hat von der Natur das Lebensrecht bekommen. Wie dem, der schwach ist, der nicht auf einem Boden steht, Der darf von niemand irgendeine Hilfe erwarten.
Hitler, das war...
Hitler was beyond our reach. I'd go further and say he was God.
Das höchste der Gefühle für mich...
My greatest dream would have been for him to come into our air raid shelter. As a child, one has these fantasies. And put his heavy, godlike Hitler hand on my shoulder and say, "You are a young German soldier."
Junger deutscher Soldat.
Dann kommt eine neue deutsche Jugend und die dressieren wir schon von ganz Kleinem an für diesen neuen Staat. Wir wollen jetzt einmal ganz eiskalt und nüchtern die Interessen unseres Volkes verteidigen.
1942
In 1942, my father came home on leave. He'd been called up. I was already in bed, and I heard him say to my mother, "If someone doesn't shoot Hitler dead soon, he'll lead us to ruin." To me, it was awful that my father could say that about our beloved Führer. We'd been indoctrinated. We knew no better. I remember even wondering whether I should report it.
Ich weiß noch, dass ich mir sogar überlegt habe, ob ich das nicht melden müsste.
As the bombing took an ever greater toll, the Nazis decided that the nation's most precious resource had to be protected. Children were evacuated to the countryside and lived in camps run by the Hitler Youth. The evacuees faced a punishing regime.
Wir hatten einen Drill dort in diesem KFV-Lager.
The drill we had in that camp was harsher than it was for many soldiers. We had team leaders on convalescent leave from the SS, from the Labour Service and from teacher training courses.
Von der SS, vom RAD, von der Lehrerbildung.
They all had their own set programs and they wanted to try them out on us. The first ones came and worked us half to death. They worked our asses off.
Und rissen uns sofort das Arschloch auf bis zur Halskrause.
Newsreels showed the evacuees enjoying happy, healthy holidays.
In one sense, we were barbarians. We did field exercises and the usual drill. But we were also taught how to kill animals, cut off chickens' heads, kill hares, wring pigeons' necks and the like. They were barbaric tactics to toughen us up.
Na Kitty, was machst du denn? Willst du noch nach Hause fahren? Ja. Na, du hast ja noch gar nichts auf deinem Bogen drauf. Wie fängt man denn einen Brief an? Natürlich, meinen lieben Eltern.
Ich bin gesund. Wie eine Rübe.
Ich hatte einmal eine falsche Anschrift.
I once made a mistake in the address and my letter was returned. Then I saw that parts of my letter had been blacked out. In other words, what I wrote was being controlled. Perhaps I wasn't saying the right thing, or maybe it was all meant to be a secret.
If you dared help yourself to pudding, even a teaspoonful of it, you were punished. The camp leader had a stick. Boys were thrashed. The boys fought each other a lot too. There was also a smokehouse in the camp that I was in. They locked you in and sealed it so you couldn't get any air. Eventually they let you out again. Or you were sent to the toilets, which were outside and hot in the summer. There were nails in the walls so you couldn't sit down or lean back, but had to stand in the stench for hours.
In the cities, older Hitler Youth boys were sent into action while the bombs were still falling.
When the siren sounded, we went to our positions. That is, we assembled first, then we were sent into action. To be sent into a firestorm after large-scale bombing was very, very dangerous. You had to go bent double in the middle of the street, because above that, the oxygen had all been consumed. And the larger buildings often collapsed, so there were a lot of dead bodies.
The bombing raids would claim more than 500,000 victims. Hitler Youth boys had to pull bodies from the ruins.
We didn't have protective suits. We did everything with our bare hands. We had to overcome our revulsion when we touched dead bodies that were covered in blood and stuck in the rubble.
Einen Toten anfassten, der natürlich blutbeschmiert war, der zum Teil eingeklemmt war.
Ich wollte die nicht anfassen. Und ich erinnere mich noch, das gehört auch zu den Sprüchen, die...
I didn't want to touch her. I remember. It was one of the things I'll never forget. There was an NCO or a sergeant, I don't remember. He bellowed at me. It was the only way he knew. He said, "Lothar, if she was still alive, you'd touch her quick enough."
Da würdest du die vielleicht gerne anfassen.
Many Hitler Youth members were commended for their bravery.
Eine Abordnung ausgezeichneter Jungen und Mädel Hamburgs in der Reichshauptstadt. Die Besichtigung des Reitsportfeldes für Ritterkreuzträger Müller, der hier selbst einmal als Rekordläufer vielfache Siege errang. Der Hitlerjunge Werner Kahl, Träger des Kriegsverdienstkreuzes mit Schwertern. Der Hitlerjunge Kurt Pörschke, 12 Jahre alt, der jüngste Träger einer Kriegsauszeichnung, rettete 8 Kinder vor dem Flammentode. Die Mädelführerin Margarete Zettel barg aus einem brennenden Säuglingsheim alle Kinder, bis die Flammen auch ihr Kleid erfasst hatten. Die tapfersten der Jungen zeichnete der Führer mit dem Eisernen Kreuz 2. Klasse aus. In schwersten Stunden haben sie bewiesen, dass sie sich wie Soldaten zu verhalten wissen.
The Hitler Youth were also needed to man the anti-aircraft defenses. Nazi statisticians calculated that 100 youths could do the work of 70 soldiers. Boys as young as 15 and 16 were recruited directly from the classroom. They were joining the Air Force and Navy as flak gunners.
Wir freuten uns sehr darauf, sehr. Und da stand unser Deutschlehrer.
We really looked forward to it a lot. Our German teacher, who was teaching us at the time, stood up, tapped his forehead with his finger, everyone who was there remembers that, and shouted, "You idiots!"
Und schrie, "Ihr Idioten!"
Some leading Nazis had concerns about the policy. Among them was Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary.
Our enemies will see the over-hasty conscription of adolescents as a sign of weakness. Their propaganda will claim that Germany has used up all her resources and as a last resort must recruit children.
Despite Bormann's objections, boys were given crash courses in handling searchlights and firing anti-aircraft guns.
Then you heard the rumble of the planes. I'll never forget it. It was a powerful rumble. It went on for about an hour and a half. In Oranienburg, and everywhere we could see, there were fires and the sound of explosions. Then everything slowly died down and we went and played cards for an hour before the second wave came over.
Dann gingen wir wieder eine Stunde Doppelkopf spielen und dann kam der nächste Alarm. Dann kam die zweite Welle.
Flak gunners were sometimes positioned on the targets themselves.
Ein Teil von uns war eingesetzt zur Bewachung von sogenannten...
Some of us were sent to guard important factories. We stood on the roofs to protect the factory and the workers from low-level planes. But there weren't any attacks from low-level planes. The planes came over at a height of 5,000 or 6,000 meters and carpet-bombed our city.
Einen richtigen Bombenteppich gelegt.
Und ich schaute dann so hoch
I looked up and wondered where they were heading. Suddenly they opened their bomb doors, and the bombs came out like little black dots that grew bigger by the second. That was the only time I felt afraid at the front. I threw myself into a trench and prayed that it would soon pass.
Und habe nur gebetet, lieber Gott, lass es vorbeigehen.
The young gunners had occasional successes.
Wir waren aber aufgrund unseres
We were so excited about shooting the plane down that we didn't stop to think. We ran straight over. It was pure curiosity.
Und dann kam auch noch.
But there were other factors. We were very interested in weapons. We were very interested in munitions. We were very interested in the uniforms, the pilots' clothes. I confess that we were so heartless at the time. We even tore the clothes off the dead pilot's body.
Toten Piloten sogar Bekleidungsstücke vom Leib gezogen haben.
The teenage flak gunners were among the first of the Hitler Youth boys called to combat. Soon, many more would see active service. By 1942, 250,000 German soldiers had died. More and more young men were needed to fight Hitler's war.
When I think of the losses, I have a mental picture of the Roll of Honor at my high school. The art teacher painted over an old drawing board and wrote 6 names on it after the Polish campaign, and another 6 names after the French campaign. Eventually, the board was full. Another was hung underneath, then one to the left, then one to the right.
Eine nächste Tafel links, eine nächste Tafel rechts.
Unermesslich sind die Aufgaben, die uns gestellt sind, die auch sein mögen. Gelöst zu werden vermögen sie nur durch einen geschlossenen Volkskörper. Und dieses Volk wird nicht erzogen in den alten Generationen, sondern es wird erzogen immer und immer in seiner Jugend. Und deshalb bin ich so stolz und so glücklich, wenn ich euch sehe.
The Nazis used big-budget feature films to sell their cause to the nation's youth. These epics taught children about the honor of dying for one's country.
Cadets was a film set in the time of Frederick the Great, but it was about my generation. It was about cadets. Matthias Fielmann was in it. It made a big impression on us. We used to sing their song, "How I long to meet the foe, when out on patrol I go."
Die kommen, Marschmeister! Los, schieß, was rausgeht!
Was hat er denn? Sein Bein ist zerschmettert.
Mir tut's auch nicht mehr weh.
Du musst ganz still liegen, hörst du?
Er hat Rahmen aus den Steinen gezogen. Dabei ist er selber erwischt worden. Am Kopf und am Rücken.
Na, ich weiß nicht. Ich weiß nicht. Eigentlich seid ihr doch gar kein so schlechter Jahrgang.
Nun kann man sich in dem Alter den Tod ja auch wohl nicht richtig ausmalen.
At that age, you can't imagine death properly. You don't have a real sense of fear. We would have laid down our lives for Germany. In other words, for Hitler.
Grob gesagt sogar für Hitler.
Grenadiere und Pioniere müssen ganze Kerle sein. Mit ihrem harten Einsatz macht sich die Hitlerjugend in ihrer Wehrertüchtigung bereits vertraut. Später wird es sich im Kampf mit dem Feind bewähren.
The Hitler Youth had always practiced military tactics in their training camps, but from 1942 the drill became even more rigorous. Boys took part in 3-week courses where they reenacted army maneuvers from earlier in the war.
Genauso wie der
Boys who joined the infantry had already done field training. They knew about camouflage and how to move in the woods or over a field or meadow. They could even dig a foxhole for cover while lying down and under shell fire. That's what they'd practiced in the Hitler Youth.
It was expected that all Hitler Youth boys would fight in the armed forces.
Dann gehört aber auch zu einer Gemeinschaft verschworener Krieger, zu einer Besatzung, mit der man dem Teufel den Bart abschneiden kann. Unser Führer Adolf Hitler. Sieg! Heil! Sieg! Heil! Sieg! Heil!
Those who couldn't make the grade were ritually humiliated.
I had to train on my own on the parade ground. I had to go out there and shout, "I'm a big idiot." I didn't mind that. But then I was told to hop across the parade ground and shout, "The Navy will be better off without me." That really upset me.
The Battle of Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 was a major turning point in Germany's war. Hitler became obsessed with holding the city that bore his greatest enemy's name. Most of those involved in the 75-day fight had once been Hitler Youth boys.
I remember one very young man. He had a very serious stomach wound. There was no hope for him. He was so proud that the mayor in Frankfurt had awarded him a medal for pulling 2 children out of the River Main. He was so proud of that. He was a really young fellow. He died, of course.
I had a huge hole in my lung and ribs, and I breathed through that. My mouth and my nose were blocked. It made a whistling sound. I thought I was a goner. I thought, you've just turned 18. Must you really defend this patch of Russian earth? Must you die here? I don't want to die. That's what I kept thinking.
Of the 300,000 German soldiers at Stalingrad, more than half died. A further 90,000 were captured by the Russians. Only 6,000 of these would ever return home.
Und jeder Deutsche noch in 1000 Jahren muss mit heiligen Schauern das Wort Stalingrad aussprechen und sich erinnern, dass dort Deutschland letzten Endes doch den Stempel zum Endsieg gesetzt hat.
When the Aryan sees no way out, he glorifies his downfall. They painted fighting till the last man was dead as heroic and valiant, rather than colossal self-destructive stupidity.
My battery only has 26 shells left. Here we crouch, still young, but no longer stupid. We once shouted Heil Hitler along with everyone else, but now we must perish or be sent to Siberia.
After the defeat at Stalingrad, the Nazis demanded a new level of commitment from the nation.
Das deutsche Volk wehrt sich gegen die totalen Kriegsmaßnahmen der Regierung. Es will nicht den totalen Krieg, sagen die Engländer, sondern die Kapitulation. Seid ihr entschlossen, dem Führer in der Erkämpfung des Sieges durch dick und dünn und der schwersten persönlichen Belastungen zu folgen?
When you see that today, it's unbelievable how people could be seduced, especially the young.
The Hitler Youth leaders ensured that their boys heeded the call to total war.
Deutsche Jugend ist angetreten, vor aller Welt zu beweisen, dass sie der feindliche Vernichtungswille und Terror nicht brechen kann, sondern sie nur härter und gläubiger macht für den Kampf unser herrliches Großdeutsches Reich.
But not everyone was happy to serve Hitler.
The idea that we might lose the war after what we'd done to other countries, this unconscious sense of guilt played a huge role. The feeling we had burnt our bridges. There was only victory or downfall. Among many young people, this feeling was very deep-rooted.
Wo wir sind, da ist immer vorne, und der Teufel lacht nur dazu. Ha, 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 wir kämpfen.
The Waffen-SS was one of Germany's most ruthless fighting forces. Its chief, Heinrich Himmler, saw the Hitler Youth as a plentiful source of new recruits.
When I went in, 3 or 4 men were sitting at a table. One said, "Someone like you, tall, strong, healthy. You'd suit the Waffen-SS. How about it?" That really turned my head. The Waffen-SS were an elite guard. Of course I wanted to join an elite guard. I clicked my heels and said, "Yes, sir."
The Waffen-SS organized elaborate advertising campaigns to attract Hitler Youth boys. They used the idea of exclusivity as a seductive tool.
When I got home, my mother was in the kitchen. I said, "Mum, I'm joining the Waffen-SS, the elite guard." Then I looked at her. She looked right through me and started to cry. Then she flew into a rage. "I knew you'd end up like this. You didn't listen to your dad. They're all criminals."
Du hast nie auf der Vater gehört. Das sind doch alles Verbrecher.
Im Westen besucht Reichsjugendführer Axmann die SS-Panzerdivision Hitlerjugend. In einer Ansprache sagt der Reichsjugendführer, die Haltung dieser jungen Soldaten und ihrer Führer ließ diese Truppe zum Sinnbild einer wahrhaft nationalsozialistischen Division werden.
Axmann volunteered 20,000 Hitler Youth boys for service in the Waffen-SS.
Der Reichsjugendführer.
The Reich youth leader gave the Führer a Hitler Youth division for his birthday on the 20th of April.
Eine Hitlerjugenddivision.
It was a warped birthday present. But it didn't occur to me then that it's monstrous to give children as a present just so they can be sent to die.
Zum Geburtstag geschenkt bekommt, zum Sterben.
As the Second World War entered its final decisive year, boys as young as 14 would be called upon to fight for Hitler. On the 6th of June 1944, D-Day, one group of teenagers was sent in to defend the Normandy beaches. Because of their age, they were nicknamed the Baby Division.
At first we thought, my God, now they're taking the children. But then we saw the children fight. I saw them myself on the stretch from Saint-Lô. I had my sights on an American tank and was going to fire, when to my horror I saw a German soldier waving his bazooka to stop us from firing. He then blew himself up with the tank. He gave his life. He had fired from under the tank.
In their first action against Canadian troops, the Baby Division knocked out 28 tanks and only lost 6 of their own.
We thought we were special. Special heroes, although we didn't use that word. We thought we were the best division in the German army. We saw any losses as proof of how tough we were and how hard we fought.
Wie hart wir eingesetzt werden konnten.
The Hitler Youth troops were ordered to hold the Normandy town of Caen at any cost. The townspeople were filled with horror as the boy soldiers arrived.
They marched in a column along a Caen street, empty of civilians. They machine-gunned every window, every flutter of a curtain. They were bareheaded, singing in their armored vehicle. You could sense their determination and absolute fanaticism. Soon afterwards, they got caught by British artillery. They were truly men of war.
A few days later, the Baby Division fought to keep open an escape corridor for thousands of German troops.
The boys were sent to the firing line. They allowed themselves to be killed in their foxholes. They didn't realize that the war was already lost. They sacrificed themselves for Germany for nothing.
They were bigger heroes than us because of their stupidity and inexperience. When you've been at the front and been wounded and have seen the corpses, you know what it's like. They were able to be brave because they didn't think about what could happen.
Within a week, 1,000 boys in the Baby Division were dead.
One boy died in my arms. I closed his eyes. I cried my eyes out. He said to me, "Lieutenant, tell my company commander to write to my mother that I died as a brave soldier, believing in the Führer and my fatherland."
Of the thousands of Hitler Youth boys fighting in Normandy, less than half returned home in autumn 1944.
They were to be loyal to the fatherland, but the fatherland was just another name for Adolf Hitler. The Germans were told, "The Holy Fatherland is in danger. Gather your sons around." The Nazis obliterated God and virtues like charity and truthfulness and any human feeling for the enemy. They got rid of them and put absolute loyalty to the fatherland and the Führer at the center of their ethic. Of course, it was all a false ethic.
The small island of Heligoland was a German naval base in the North Sea and home to a group of Hitler Youth boys. It was on the route of the Allied bombers flying their nightly sorties into Germany, but up till 3 weeks before the end of the war, Heligoland had escaped an air raid.
At first it seemed like any other attack, but then we realized it was directed at us. They carpet-bombed. It was a total surprise and a massive attack. 1,000 planes bombarded that small island for an hour. It was dreadful.
It was one of the biggest bombing raids of the entire war.
I fell into a bomb crater. An older soldier was lying there, a sergeant. He was bleeding to death. He had some kind of internal injury. He had no hair. I only mention that because I put my hand under his head. I wanted to get out of there. Bombs were raining down. I wanted to get back to the bunker because I knew I'd be safe there. And he kept saying, "Stay with me, lad."
Und sagte immer, Junge, bleib bei mir.
Of the estimated 500 troops stationed on Heligoland, 120 died in the RAF raid.
Und als ich dann ins Freie wieder kam, dann sah ich die vielen Toten.
When I went outside afterwards, I saw all the corpses.
In meiner Batterie, die nicht, die am Ende
The boys in my battery were all dead. They'd fallen where they'd been standing at the start of the raid.
wo sie am Anfang waren.
The majority of my classmates perished.
Die Mehrzahl meiner Klassenkameraden ist da gefallen.
The small town of Zoltau lay only a few miles away from two concentration camps, Bergen-Belsen and Westerbork. Since 1942, the people of Zoltau had watched goods trains laden with Jews heading for the camps. At the end of the war, the Nazis attempted to hide the evidence of the Holocaust and started transferring prisoners away. On the 11th of April 1945, there was a bombing raid on Zoltau. A train full of prisoners ground to a halt. As the guards ran for cover, the prisoners escaped from their carriages and fled.
And so at least 40 or 50 Hitler Youth boys were sent out on this very sad hunt to round up the prisoners in the town.
Eingesetzt, nun diese Häftlinge hier einzutreiben im Stadtgebiet.
These orders were largely carried out, and by the evening about 60 or 70 prisoners had been rounded up.
Mindestens 60 bis 70 Häftlinge eingetrieben.
The military commanders ordered the local Hitler Youth boys to herd the prisoners into a wood. There they were told to execute them.
Das war also eine Erschießung, die dann damals...
The shooting took place as it started to grow dark. The prisoners were lined up in rows, and we Hitler Youth boys were given the order to shoot these poor people. I'd like to exclude myself from this. I was not part of the firing squad.
In diesen in dieses Exekutionskommando hineingehörte. Sicherlich habe ich damals schon mit 17 Jahren empfunden.
Even at the age of 17, I felt something very unjust and cruel was happening.
Sicherlich davon.
And that undoubtedly kept me from shooting anyone and caused me great distress.
Sondern dass mir das schon einfach zu viel wurde.
Volker Fischer and his father went to the local party headquarters to demand an explanation.
Genau das hat auch mein Vater diese Leute gefragt.
My father asked them, why is this being asked of children and of my son? Why of them? They replied, we want to train the young to become even more tough and not to hold back from any cruelty. That was their attitude.
Vor keiner Grausamkeit zurückschrecken. Das war die Einstellung.
Only 13 days later, British soldiers discovered the mass grave. More than 90 prisoners had been killed.
During all those years in the Hitler Youth, not once did a resistance fighter come to me and say, Werner, stop it. This is the wrong way. You're going astray. This party isn't doing us any good at all.
Bringt uns nichts Gutes. Nichts.
Hitler Youth boys paid a heavy price for their loyalty. Many of these teenage soldiers would die thousands of miles from home, or commit atrocities that still haunt them today. By the autumn of 1944, the German army was increasingly relying on boy soldiers to fight Hitler's war. It was in the ranks of the Hitler Youth movement that they had learned to die for the Third Reich.
It was our duty. We had to fight to the last, come what may, because the flag was greater than death.
To die for the Führer, the people, and the fatherland if necessary. That's what they trained us for.
Despite the training, the teenage army was no match for the massive firepower of British and American forces in the West, or the marauding Red Army in the East. But the boy soldiers of the Hitler Youth were still Germany's most fervent defenders.
They were really fanatical. It's quite indescribable. And they really were children. I was 17, but they were 15 or younger.
The Hitler Youth boys were prepared to fight on, even when regular German troops were giving up.
Our white flag made it clear that we were surrendering. We had orders to cross the lines. For the Hitler Youth boys, it was as if their world had fallen apart. They cried, "We're fighting on. We'll never surrender."
As the Third Reich collapsed on all fronts, the regime would demand the ultimate price from the Hitler Youth. But why were these schoolboys prepared to sacrifice their lives for Hitler? By Christmas 1944, the Nazis had been pushed back from the French Atlantic coast to the German border. A massive counterattack was planned in the Ardennes. On the morning of the 16th of December, a huge German artillery barrage began what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. Failure was not an option.
They'd stuffed us full of propaganda. We heard it from the officers and on the radio. They kept on telling us that we had to win, no matter how.
The offensive began well for the Germans, but the early successes were short-lived.
As for the Hitler Youth leading us on to victory, it would have been madness to believe it. I learned how to cry.
Gunther Muntz was a Hitler Youth boy in the Ardennes. He saw firsthand the full force of the Allied firepower.
It was a quiet night, but ice cold. It was Christmas Eve, but we didn't think about it. I scratched a hole with my spade and put some straw in it. I fell asleep very quickly, probably from sheer exhaustion. In the morning I was woken by a dreadful din, artillery firing and bombs falling. You couldn't tell which was which.
Allied bombers had seized the first clear night of the battle. They unleashed a mammoth aerial attack.
Then there came a dreadful bang. A shell or a bomb had exploded nearby. I crawled back into the hole and noticed I'd been hit in the lower leg. And then blood started to spurt out. I held the wound closed as best I could.
After the initial German successes, the Allies quickly gained supremacy in the Ardennes. The campaign would cost Germany more than 100,000 lives. On the home front, government broadcasts ignored the bloodshed and concentrated on Christmas.
Zurück in die Weihnachtsseligkeit der Kindertage.
Dispatches from the Ardennes were carefully filtered by the Nazi Minister of Propaganda.
Welches deutsche Herz wollte nicht vor Stolz und Ergriffenheit höher schlagen, wenn ich hier unserer Soldaten gedenke, die nun seit über einer Woche im Westen wieder in der Offensive stehen und durch ihr Heldentum und ihre durch nichts gebrochene und durch nichts zu brechende Angriffskraft die ganze Welt in staunende Bewunderung versetzen.
By Christmas 1944, the average life expectancy of new recruits in the German army was only 1 month. A Nazi decree passed a few weeks earlier meant that many of these new recruits were schoolboys. On the 19th of October 1944, boys born in 1928 had been declared ready for war. Boys of 15 and 16 proudly volunteered to fight for their country. Many of these boys were joining the Volkssturm, the Home Guard. This army of schoolboys and grandfathers would provide a final line of defense for the German homeland.
Everyone wanted to be a soldier and go to the front. All the boys felt like that.
We were really keen. Just let those Russians come. They'd be in for it. That was pretty much our attitude.
2.5 million Red Army soldiers and 3,000 tanks were already on German soil and determined to reach Berlin. In the last days of January 1945, the Russians completely encircled Königsberg in East Prussia, now Kaliningrad in Russia. The Nazis declared it a stronghold to be defended at all costs.
I volunteered as I thought Königsberg must be defended. It went without saying.
Das war eigentlich selbstverständlich.
The Nazis released a film called Kolberg that glorified the victorious stand of besieged Germans against Napoleonic forces. The boys were inspired by its message.
If you fight as hard as you can and keep fighting, you will win. They won in Kolberg and we will win too.
The reality in Königsberg was very different.
The Russians kept up an unbelievable barrage. Even soldiers who'd been in the war for years said they'd never seen anything like it. The boys in our trench were 14 years old. 2 were 12. They cried, "Help, Mum." The soldiers wept and said, "Get the kids out." It was chaos, psychologically too.
It is a pleasure to witness the defense of Königsberg, wrote the official Nazi newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter.
I received the message, "Alert Phase 4, stop all retreating army and home guard units." Full of the importance of this message, I went down to the cellar. The acting battalion commander came towards me, a wine glass in one hand, his arm round a Russian girl, a forced laborer sent to work in Germany. When he saw me, he looked guilty. I thought, what's he doing? That's racial defilement. I really thought that. He shouted, "What are you doing here, coward? All the others are busy putting out fires. I'll have you shot." Of course, I left quick smart. I thought, I'm through with all this. At home, my mother said, "Where have you been?" I said, "I've left the Home Guard." She was very happy. I changed out of my uniform, threw it on the rubble, and was a little boy again.
Und dann habe ich mich umgezogen, habe die Uniform in die Trümmer geschmissen und dann war ich wieder ein kleiner Junge.
Most boys followed orders and stayed at the front.
Wir konnten damit rechnen, dass bis zum nächsten Mittag.
We could expect that by midday, the following midday, most of them wouldn't be alive.
Völlig unsinnig. Solche.
It was utterly senseless to send such young boys to the front line. It was bordering on the criminal. It was really quite unpardonable from any moral point of view and couldn't be justified.
Von der inneren Einstellung her zu rechtfertigen und zu verhalten.
And yet the Nazis had to do it if they wanted to have any defensive capacity at all.
Noch wenigstens einen Hauch von Verteidigungsfähigkeit zu erhalten.
The battle for Königsberg raged on for months. But before the final surrender, hundreds of Hitler Youth boys were withdrawn. The SS needed them for special duties. At Palmnicken near Königsberg, a group of Hitler Youth boys had been withdrawn from fighting the Red Army. They had been selected for a special assignment.
Wir kamen also in dieses Bürgermeisteramt.
We entered the mayor's office. There were 3 SS officers there, disguised in other uniforms. They looked sinister and didn't say a word. I didn't like them from the start. It slowly dawned on us that they were taking us somewhere for a special task. We, or at least I, had the feeling we had been selected for something special.
The boys were told to escort a group of Jewish women to an abandoned quarry.
They had to kneel down at the edge of a pit, which was full of corpses. They were shot in the back of the neck. You heard their death rattle when the sounds of the shots had died down. They were still moving in the pit as they breathed their last. I also saw a boy finishing them off with his gun. Perhaps one day he'd be able to say, "At least I too shot a few Jews dead."
Ich habe wenigstens auch dazwischen geschossen unter die Juden. Ich bin dann nach Hause gegangen.
I went home shamefaced and despondent. I could hear the rumbling of the front. What was to become of us? It was clear to me that when the Russians came, we would have to defend ourselves to the last. They would kill us all. We were all guilty.
Wir sind alle mitschuldig.
As the Red Army advanced, they savagely punished German civilians.
Da bin ich so in den Raum rein, der vielleicht Unterrichtsraum war.
I went into the room, a classroom, and looked around. On my way out, I saw a pair of legs behind the door. There lay an older woman. She must have been about 60. She had been raped to death.
Die hatte man buchstäblich zu Tode vergewaltigt.
Scenes like these were common in Nazi newsreels.
In view of such pictures, and also the rapes, we were filled with an unimaginable hate. We would have slaughtered anyone.
Breslau was another fortified German city in the east. It is now Wrocław in Poland. The citizens of Breslau received specific instructions.
Breslaus Bevölkerung ist von ihrem Gauleiter aufgerufen worden, die Stadt bis zum Äußersten zu verteidigen. Mannesmut und Panzerfaust stoppen jeden Panzer.
Over 1,000 Hitler Youth boys joined in the defense of the city.
Then I went to my parents and said, now I'm a soldier. My mother said, oh no, now they're taking the children too. I received the order on my birthday, along with 3 or 4 friends, including my schoolmate, Georg. We were to report to a section of the front line.
The boys turned up a day late because of Christian Ludtke's birthday. When they arrived, they found themselves in trouble.
I came to the bridge and a guard said, Ludtke, you're under arrest. You're not worthy of the German uniform. And he tore off my jacket.
The local Hitler Youth leader attended to the case personally. He told the boys he would be lenient.
In your case, we'll treat it as a thoughtless, foolish act, and so we won't impose the harshest penalty, court-martial and firing squad. But as you were the ringleader, you won't get 20 strokes with a stick, you'll get 25.
Nicht mit 20 Stockschlägen abmachen, sondern du bekommst 25. Beiß die Zähne zusammen und gab dann...
Grit your teeth, he said. And then he beat me and said, off to the front, lad, prove yourself. I hope I can soon pin the Iron Cross on you.
To withstand the Red Army onslaught, a Hitler Youth combat group was formed. Some boys had to be driven into enemy fire at gunpoint.
An enormous sergeant stood there with a pistol leveled at me. He asked me what I was doing. I said, I've got a shell splinter in my backside. It really was bleeding a little, so he let me go down into the cellar. Other boys wanted to get back inside too, but they weren't wounded, and he chased them outside at gunpoint. They had to go back to the embankment.
The railway embankment marked the battle line around the city.
The Russians were dug in at the top of the embankment. We were supposed to drive them back behind it. But from the embankment they could cover everything with their machine guns. So we were just being sacrificed. It was completely crazy.
It was a hopeless fight and could only lead to more losses. A lot of boys were crying, not only because they were hurt, but because they were scared.
German commanders attempted to negotiate a truce.
Our white flag made it clear that we were surrendering. We had orders to cross the lines. For the Hitler Youth boys, it was as if their world had fallen apart. They cried, "We're fighting on, we'll never surrender." But we had to get across. Of course, it felt strange. It was no good ordering them or arguing with them. They just stood there and blocked our way.
When Breslau finally fell in May 1945, half the Hitler Youth soldiers were dead. The rest were captured by the Red Army. But it wasn't just in the east that Hitler Youth boys were dying. On the Western Front, they would have to face the Americans. During the spring of 1945, the Americans crossed the Rhine, pushing deep into the heart of Germany. American soldiers were the perfect target for ambitious Hitler Youth boys hoping to prove their worth.
We saw an American tank. Its left track had been shot off, but otherwise it was all right.
The turret was open. Beside the tank lay 4 Hitler Youth boys, almost in a row. They were screaming out in agony because, after the explosion, an American soldier, realizing his tank was not on fire, had opened the turret and fired a burst from his submachine gun. The boys had been celebrating. They'd been standing up, which no soldier does. But these boys were only 15. The bullets had hit them in the stomach. It's the worst sight imaginable. Their stomachs were torn and their insides falling out. One was calling for his mother, and they wanted water.
The Americans were also horrified.
They were shocked when they saw the boys. They got out their first aid packs. But they were soldiers. They couldn't do anything. They just stood around awkwardly.
On the 7th of April 1945, 4 Hitler Youth boys arrived at Brettheim, a small town near Nuremberg.
The Hitler Youth boys came from Nordhausen am Bach, equipped with 4 bazookas, a rifle, and 4 stick grenades. A man who saw them from a window called out, "Go away, lads. What is there to defend here? We don't want you. Go home."
Geht fort, was wollt ihr hier bei uns verteidigen?
The leader of the boys called up to him, "If you don't shut your trap, you'll be the first we hang."
Wenn du dein Gosch nicht hältst, dann bist du der Erste, den wir aufhängen.
The townspeople were determined not to provoke an American attack. One of them approached the boys.
Ging gleich auf den Anführer los.
He went up to their leader and asked, "What do you want? What are you doing?" The leader got cheeky, and Farmer Hanselmann boxed his ears. Then the 4 youths stopped being soldiers and were boys again. Some of them put their bazookas down, and the rest had theirs taken off them. And then they turned back in tears.
Und sind heulend wieder in ihren Ausgangspunkt zurück.
The bazookas were thrown into the lake. The boys immediately reported this to the local SS.
Then the wheels started to turn. A few hours later, a firing squad turned up in Brettheim.
3 men were sentenced to death. The farmer, Friedrich Hanselmann, the mayor, Leonhard Gagstatter, and the local party leader, Leonhard Wolfmeier.
The boys and a few soldiers collected tables, boxes and chairs, and built 3 pyramids under the linden trees at the cemetery gate. The Hitler Youth boys had brought a concertina with them. They hung around near the trees and on the cemetery wall, and yelled and sang and played music.
Und haben gegrölt und gesungen und gespielt.
The worst thing was that after the sentences had been read out under the linden trees, the boys squabbled as the men climbed up or were lifted up. The mayor was 64 years old, after all. They squabbled as to who should pull away the chairs and send them to their deaths.
64 Jahre alt, wer die Stühle wegziehen darf, sie in den Tod zu stoßen. Dann gingen die Hitlerjungen wieder raus zum Friedhof.
Then the Hitler Youth boys went back to the cemetery, where they sang and played songs, like "The Frail Old Bones Are Trembling." They grabbed the feet of the hanged men and swung them round in a circle. It was worse than the executions to see these honorable men being dishonored.
So in der Tat.
At the Junker Cadet School in Bad Tolz near Munich, the Waffen-SS trained local Hitler Youth boys to fight the Americans. The boys practiced military maneuvers and learned the importance of loyalty.
Perhaps the most important thing was the sense of belonging to a community and sharing the responsibility for it, meaning that the moment I bail out, I leave others in the lurch.
At Bad Tolz, the schoolboys got their chance to fight when a squad of Hitler Youth boys was dispatched to repel the Americans at a bridge outside the town.
Our yearning for a big adventure had already faded somewhat, as the bridge seemed totally uninteresting, totally insignificant. We were all the more surprised when an American tank turned up.
Es ist ein Malen und es ist ein
Tanks make a grating sound, an inhuman, mechanical sound. When you hear it, you can't imagine men could be inside. It's as if some huge force was approaching, against which one is obviously defenseless.
auf einen zu, dem man ausgeliefert ist.
I think about 7 or 8 bazooka rounds were fired at the tank. 1 or 2 of them probably hit it dead on.
Voll getroffen.
The result was an immediate attack from the air.
Plötzlich waren
Suddenly 2 fighter planes appeared overhead. They hunted us down like rabbits. There's no other way to describe it.
beschreiben.
When one of us was killed, we were filled with horror and panic.
When the survivors made it back to Bad Tolz, they were told to defend a second bridge.
Ich wollte nicht draufgehen.
I didn't want to die.
Ich habe versucht,
I tried to explain it to my 2 friends.
dieses klar zu machen und
I couldn't convince them.
ich konnte sie nicht überzeugen.
Gregor Dorfmeister went home.
Ich denke mal, dass sie mich für
When I left, they looked at me as if I was a coward.
The next morning, he found his friends dead.
Ich habe mich nicht gut gefühlt.
I didn't feel good, but I know that I'd probably have been lying there too if I hadn't left.
Gelegen wäre, wenn ich nicht gegangen wäre.
In Berlin, the Hitler Youth were preparing barricades. Posters demanded that Berliners defend every street to the last. Some Hitler Youth boys still believed that they were on the brink of the final victory.
I didn't want Berlin to be occupied by Soviet soldiers. I wanted to defend Berlin. But I didn't know what the full story was. They had said General Wenck was coming with a relief army, and we only had to defend the bridges over the Havel till Wenck came, and we could celebrate the final victory. They were still telling us that tale in March 1945.
At the Reich Sports Ground in Berlin, a group of Hitler Youth boys gathered to hear a speech by the organizer of the 1936 Olympics, Karl Diem.
His speech was peppered with quotations in which dying for the fatherland, the act of sacrifice, heroic sacrifice, was celebrated. We were youngsters of 16 or 17 who had been filled with ideals. 500 of us had assembled there. If the Russians had come to the sports ground then, we'd have attacked them at once. But the adults knew the war was lost. The Russians had reached the Oder. They were preparing to attack Berlin. In that respect, his speech was criminal and showed contempt for humanity.
A few weeks later, the Hitler Youth Boys gathered again to watch a very different kind of spectacle.
We had to be present at the shooting of 6 soldiers. 3 of them were our age. They were shot for being absent without leave. We had been given orders to attend, not as the firing squad, but as spectators up on the bank. It was made clear that anyone who was absent without leave would be hanged or shot.
The Home Guard made sure that Berliners were armed and knew how to use their weapons.
We were given a French gun which was extremely long. We had to put the ammunition in our pocket. Then we were each given a bazooka and we had to put the fuses in the other pocket. We also had a hand grenade which we put in our belts. And that's how we left the battery.
Und damit zogen wir dann aus der Batterie los.
Preparations to defend Berlin continued. Many Hitler Youth Boys were involved.
Wir waren auch ein bisschen.
We were a little proud that we were being transported to the front like grown-ups. There's no denying that. That's how it was. We grew up all of a sudden.
Das war einfach da. Wir wurden mit einem Schlage erwachsen. Die Angst wurde uns einfach.
We'd been taught not to feel fear. We weren't allowed to show emotion, but always had to exercise discipline, self-discipline, and we always had to see things through to the end.
On the eastern bank of the river Oder, Soviet troops stood ready to attack. They were only 70 kilometers away from Berlin. On the night of the 16th of April 1945, the Red Army launched a massive attack on the Seelower Heights. More than 16,000 cannon opened fire on the last fortified position east of Berlin.
Es war eine Art Höllengewitter.
It was a kind of infernal storm. It was unimaginably awful. You sit in a hole and the minutes turn to quarter hours, and the hours turn to eternities. Time stands still.
Die Zeit läuft nicht.
In just a few days, 50,000 died.
Das wussten wir auch alle.
We all knew it was the end of our childhood, the end of our youth. We would never be the same again.
Nothing now stood between the Red Army and Berlin. The Hitler Youth Boys faced their final test. In April 1945, the Red Army started its final push on Berlin. As the Soviet artillery pounded German positions, Nazi commanders moved Hitler Youth troops to the front line. Red Army soldiers were shocked when they saw who they were fighting.
They weren't soldiers, they were kids, 14-year-olds or at most 16-year-olds. Just kids wet behind the ears who should have been at home. They weren't soldiers, but they wore soldiers' trench coats. The coats hung loose on them. They were made for adults.
The Red Army soldiers called them the Bazooka Boys.
I was once shot at by one of those bazooka boys. I was wounded, and the soldier who got me was just a kid, a member of a Hitler Youth group or team or whatever.
The war was lost, but the Hitler Youth Boys were determined to fight on.
Without thinking of themselves, they went to their deaths. They actually forced the Russians to turn back. But after that, everywhere on the street, children lay dead in their Hitler Youth uniforms.
Hitler was still determined to spur on the youngest recruits. Cameras were present to capture the moment he handed out medals to his most loyal young soldiers.
I wanted my father to go to the cinema in a few weeks' time and see his son being presented with the Iron Cross by the Führer, and see I wasn't a weakling.
The pictures were never used because Hitler already looked like a broken man.
He was trembling. His face was trembling too. The only thing that was strong about him was his gaze, his expression. Apart from that, he looked like an old man.
At Hitler's side was one of his most devoted henchmen, Arthur Axmann, the Hitler Youth leader.
With hindsight, I'd say Axmann was obsessed with showing the Führer how loyal the young were. He could only do that if he believed in the Führer. I'm convinced he believed that Hitler was superhuman.
Axmann was responsible for sending thousands of boys to their deaths. Years later, he still defends his actions.
Wir kapitulieren nie.
We would never surrender, because it would mean burning our bridges. All we could do was look ahead and fight honorably to the end.
Und ehrenvoll bis zum Ende zu kämpfen.
Surviving Hitler Youth Boys see it differently.
It was a callous sacrifice of human beings, in a situation in which the people who issued the orders knew it was senseless.
Anordneten und befohlen haben, genau wussten, dass es völlig sinnlos war.
We were cannon fodder. Nothing but cannon fodder, sent to replace older, experienced soldiers.
While many experienced soldiers were prepared to surrender, Hitler Youth Boys were told to carry on fighting.
Ich weiß nur, dass Axmann nicht wollte, dass junge...
I know Axmann didn't want Hitler Youth Boys to fight in units alongside old soldiers. He wanted to prevent the old soldiers saying to the boys, "This is shit. Let's just try to survive and get out of this mess."
Das zu überleben und aus dem Dreck rauszukommen.
Ist die Standhaftigkeit selbst. Nie sah ich ihn wanken oder verzagen, schwach oder müde werden. Wird seinen Weg bis zum Ende gehen. Führerbefehl, wir folgen.
We were defending the Führer. We were told things could still turn around from one day to the next. Then we'd wrap it up and the war would be won.
In April 1945, Hitler retreated to his bunker. But the bridges over the Havel were still a potential escape route to the west. Axmann promised he would use his schoolboy army to keep them open. It was a suicide mission for the boys.
They knew that the bridge was the eye of the needle, and that when passing through it, they'd be fully exposed to Russian fire.
To the Red Army gunners, the Hitler Youth boys were sitting ducks.
There was firing and shelling right, left and center. There were dead and wounded lying around everywhere. The stomach of one of them had been ripped open. It was dreadful. The bridge was a bloodbath. There were hundreds of dead and people with all sorts of injuries. They lay there and vehicles drove over them and there were rivers of blood. I was in a motorcycle sidecar and saw it all. It was a sight I'll never forget. As I said, there were rivers of blood. People were stepped on, crushed to death.
Boys from the Hitler Youth had been sacrificed for the Nazi High Command.
Axmann liked to argue that our holding the Havel Bridge gave a lot of people the chance to flee over the Elbe. But that was another piece of fiction. Who did we do it for? So Himmler, the Jew murderer Himmler, could escape? Was I to sacrifice my life for a Jew murderer? It's too awful.
On the 30th of April, Berlin's city center fell. Only a few meters separated Red Army soldiers from Hitler's bunker. Under reinforced concrete several meters thick, Hitler weighed up his options.
The longer it went on and the gloomier the prospects became, the more every conversation turned to death. They thought about how to kill themselves. Should they shoot themselves? Or should they take a cyanide capsule, which most of them already had with them?
Some still talked about escaping.
Axmann hatte die Vorstellung,
Axmann had the idea that Hitler could escape in the middle of a small group of Hitler Youth boys.
Durch die Einklammerung durchkommen könnte.
He suggested to Hitler that the boys be used as a human shield.
Schild dem Führer zur Verfügung zu stellen.
Hitler decided against the plan. Instead, he dictated a private will and a political will. He stated that he had never intended war in 1939. He then took his own life. The Battle of Berlin continued for another 3 days. Thousands more young soldiers died. Finally, the German army, the Wehrmacht, capitulated.
Aus dem Hauptquartier des Großadmirals für 9. Mai 1945. Das Oberkommando der Wehrmacht gibt bekannt. Seit Mitternacht schweigen nun an allen Fronten die Waffen. Auf Befehl des Großadmirals hat die Wehrmacht den aussichtslos gewordenen Kampf eingestellt.
They said we'd win because we had the Führer. He and the miracle weapons would save us. Now the Führer was dead, and that dashed all our hopes that the war could be won. Everything, the dream, was over. We just tried to survive.
For 12 years, the Hitler Youth had controlled every facet of German children's lives. With their master dead, Hitler's children were free.
He was dead, and with him the Hitler Youth. Without Hitler, there was no Hitler Youth. It was strange. I was oddly unaffected by it all. But at the same time, I had the feeling, now you're completely free.
Also jetzt bist du eigentlich völlig frei.
Du lebst. You're alive. The war is over. A feeling of great happiness.
Everything that I had believed in, it all proved to be nothing. Nothing was left.
Nichts. Es blieb nichts übrig.
Natürlich bin ich oft gefragt.
Of course, I've often been asked the question about what motivated us. The cool teenagers of today ask, why were you so stupid as to go along with it? I can only reply, thank God you can ask that question. We couldn't have asked it.
Nicht stellen können.